before Auschwitz, before Treblinka, before the names the world would one day fear. There was a place designed to perfect terror. Just outside Berlin, within sight of ordinary German life, the Nazis built a camp not to hide their cruelty, but to refine it. This was Sachsenhausen. Here, suffering was organized, measured, and taught. Every gate, every barack, every punishment was carefully planned, not as chaos, but as policy. Prisoners did not enter this camp to disappear quietly. They entered to be broken, studied, disciplined, and used as examples. Guards were trained here. Commandants learned here. Methods of control were tested here, then exported across an entire continent. If you want to understand how the Holocaust became possible, you don't start at the end. You start here, at the place where terror was turned into a system and cruelty became routine. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The idea of a model camp. Sachsenhausen did not emerge suddenly, nor was it an accident of war. Its origins lie in the earliest years of Nazi rule, when repression was still being improvised and terror had not yet been fully systematized. In 1933, after Adolf Hitler's appointment as chancellor, Germany transformed rapidly from a fragile democracy into a police state. The Reichstag fire provided the pretext, emergency decrees suspended civil liberties, and arrests began almost immediately. Communists, Social Democrats, trade union leaders, journalists, intellectuals, and anyone identified as an opponent of the regime were taken into custody, often without warrants, trials, or legal recourse. Early concentration camps sprang up hastily in disused factories, abandoned barracks, breweries, and warehouses, guarded by SA men whose authority was arbitrary and whose brutality was unchecked. These early camps succeeded in spreading fear, but they were chaotic, violent in unpredictable ways, and politically unstable. They reflected rage rather than strategy. As the Nazi regime consolidated power, Heinrich Himmler and the SS recognized a deeper problem. Terror alone was not enough. Violence needed discipline. Repression needed continuity. Fear had to become routine. The camps, if they were to serve the long-term ambitions of the regime, had to be redesigned as permanent institutions, places where human beings could be controlled, categorized, exploited, and destroyed with consistency. The SS sought to replace improvisation with order, chaos with procedure, and uncontrolled brutality with calculated cruelty. This shift marked the transformation of the concentration camp from a temporary tool of intimidation into a foundational pillar of Nazi governance. By the mid-1930s, the SS had succeeded in wresting control of the camp system away from the SA and local authorities. Camps were centralized under SS command, regulations were standardized, and a new ideological mission took shape. The camps were no longer meant only for political enemies. The definition of enemy itself expanded. Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, people labeled asocial, habitual criminals, and those deemed racially or biologically inferior were increasingly targeted. The camps became instruments of social engineering, designed to cleanse the German body politic through isolation, punishment, and elimination. It was within this ideological evolution that Sachsenhausen was conceived. Unlike earlier camps, Sachsenhausen would be built deliberately according to plan from the ground up. Its location near Berlin was no coincidence. Positioned close to the administrative heart of the Reich, Sachsenhausen would serve both symbolic and practical purposes. It would demonstrate SS authority, operate under direct oversight, and function as a showcase of the new camp system. Foreign delegations, inspectors, and officials would be shown a version of the camp carefully curated to conceal its brutality, while inside its perimeter, terror would be refined into policy. Construction began in 1936. The camp's design reflected the SS obsession with order, hierarchy, and surveillance. Sachsenhausen was laid out in a triangular formation, with the commandant's headquarters positioned at the apex. From this central point, guards could observe nearly the entire camp, a physical manifestation of absolute authority. Prisoner barracks radiated outward in rigid symmetry, reinforcing the idea that every inmate existed within the SS field of vision. Nothing about the camp was accidental. Architecture itself became a tool of domination. Sachsenhausen was intended to be copied. Its layout, discipline codes, punishment methods, administrative structures, and labor organization were all documented, analyzed, and refined. SS officers from across the Reich were sent there for training. They studied how to manage prisoners, how to impose psychological degradation, how to enforce obedience through exhaustion and fear, and how to normalize violence as routine work. The camp became an instructional center where cruelty was taught as a skill and indifference as a virtue. For prisoners, Sachsenhausen represented a new kind of imprisonment. Arrival meant immediate disorientation. Names were replaced by numbers. Identity was stripped away through uniforms, shaved heads, and ritualized humiliation. Daily life was governed by roll calls that lasted hours, arbitrary punishments, starvation rations, forced labor, and constant surveillance. The purpose was not merely to confine bodies, but to break minds. Resistance, even passive resistance, was met with collective punishment. Survival depended on submission, chance, and the slow erosion of human dignity. Because Sachsenhausen stood at the center of the SS camp system, it became a testing ground for methods that would later be exported across Nazi-occupied Europe. Systems of classification, color-coded badges, labor deployment, disciplinary blocks, and execution procedures were developed and standardized here. What proved effective in Sachsenhausen would be implemented elsewhere at Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Dachau, and eventually in the extermination camps of the East. In this sense, Sachsenhausen was not merely one camp among many. It was the prototype. It demonstrated how terror could be rationalized, bureaucratized, and made sustainable. It showed how a modern state could transform ideology into infrastructure and violence into routine administration. The lessons learned here would echo through the Holocaust itself. This chapter marks the beginning of that system, not with mass murder, but with planning, design, and intention. Sachsenhausen was where the Nazis learned how to rule through fear and how to teach others to do the same. And once those lessons were mastered, the consequences would be catastrophic. Chapter 1, Segment 2. Engineering Control. Designing a camp to command human beings. When Sachsenhausen began receiving prisoners in the summer of 1936, it immediately distinguished itself from earlier concentration camps, not by being more humane, but by being more deliberate. Every aspect of the camp was designed to impose order, predictability, and domination. This was not a place that relied on random violence alone. Sachsenhausen was built to make cruelty systematic, efficient, and repeatable. It represented a shift from improvised repression to engineered control, where terror became a managed process rather than an emotional outburst. The physical layout of the camp embodied this philosophy. Unlike the irregular shapes of earlier camps, Sachsenhausen followed a strict geometric plan. The triangular formation placed the SS command center at the apex, creating a literal hierarchy carved into the landscape. From this elevated position, guards could observe the prisoner barracks arranged in a fan-like pattern below. The design ensured that power always flowed in one direction, from the SS outward, downward, and inward into every corner of prisoner life. Visibility itself became a weapon. Prisoners were constantly aware that they could be seen, watched, judged, and punished at any moment. This architectural dominance was reinforced by daily routines engineered to strip inmates of autonomy. Roll calls, known as appel, were held at least twice a day and often lasted for hours, regardless of weather. Prisoners were forced to stand motionless in heat, rain, or snow while SS officers counted, recounted, and punished discrepancies. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who died during roll call were kept upright until the count was completed. These rituals were not simply about maintaining order. They were exercises in collective degradation, designed to teach obedience through exhaustion and fear. Sachsenhausen was also where the SS perfected the internal hierarchy among prisoners, a system that shifted part of the burden of control onto the inmates themselves. Certain prisoners were elevated to positions of authority as capos, block elders, or work supervisors. These individuals were often chosen from criminal categories and were granted privileges in exchange for enforcing discipline. This structure fractured solidarity among prisoners, fostering mistrust and resentment while allowing the SS to rule indirectly. Violence became decentralized. The camp did not need constant SS intervention because prisoners were compelled to police one another. Crucially, Sachsenhausen functioned as a training ground for SS personnel. Officers from across Germany and occupied territories were sent there to learn how to run camps correctly. They studied regulations, discipline manuals, punishment protocols, and labor management systems. They observed interrogations, punishments, and executions. They were taught how to dehumanize without hesitation and how to maintain emotional distance from suffering. The camp served as a classroom where cruelty was normalized and professionalism was redefined to include indifference to human life. Punishment methods at Sachsenhausen were not spontaneous acts of sadism, though sadism certainly existed. They were codified. Prisoners could be flogged on specially designed whipping benches, suspended by their arms in torturous positions, confined in dark cells, or sent to punishment companies that performed the most exhausting labor until collapse. Each punishment had a purpose: to deter resistance, to demonstrate absolute power, and to reinforce the idea that survival depended entirely on compliance. Forced labor was another pillar of Sachsenhausen's function. Prisoners were deployed in quarries, brickworks, workshops, and later in factories tied directly to the German war economy. Labor was not organized for productivity alone. It was organized to exhaust. Tasks were deliberately pointless at times, moving stones from one place to another and back again, designed to break spirits rather than produce value. This philosophy of extermination through labor would later become a central feature of the wider camp system. One of Sachsenhausen's most infamous installations was the shoe testing track, a circular path of different surfaces, gravel, sand, concrete, where prisoners were forced to march for hours or days wearing prototype military footwear. Many collapsed from exhaustion, injuries, or malnutrition. The experiment measured durability, but it also served as a punishment disguised as labor. It reflected the camp's dual purpose: serving the needs of the Reich while consuming human lives as expendable resources. Medical abuse also took root at Sachsenhausen during this period. Doctors conducted experiments without consent, using prisoners as test subjects for new drugs, treatments, or endurance trials. These experiments were framed as scientific research, further illustrating how bureaucracy and language masked brutality. Paperwork transformed torture into procedure. Reports replaced screams. Forms replaced faces. As Sachsenhausen matured, it became the administrative nerve center of the Nazi camp system. Policies tested here were exported elsewhere. Commandants trained here went on to run other camps. Guard units rotated through Sachsenhausen before deployment. In this way, the camp functioned not just as a site of imprisonment, but as a factory producing expertise in oppression. What worked here became doctrine. For prisoners, Sachsenhausen was a place where hope was systematically dismantled. Survival required adaptation to an environment designed to crush individuality. Small acts, sharing food, whispering encouragement, preserving dignity, became forms of resistance. But the system was relentless. Every structure, rule, and routine existed to remind inmates that they were disposable. By the end of the 1930s, Sachsenhausen had fulfilled its intended purpose. It had proven that terror could be organized, standardized, and taught. It had shown that a modern state could train its agents to administer suffering with bureaucratic efficiency. And it had laid the groundwork for something even darker. Because once the Nazis mastered how to control, break, and exploit human beings on an industrial scale, the next question was no longer whether people could be destroyed, but how many and how quickly. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Categories of enemies. How the system decided who deserved to live. By the late 1930s, Sachsenhausen had evolved beyond a detention site for political opponents. It had become a laboratory for classification, an institution obsessed not merely with controlling bodies, but with sorting human beings into rigid categories of value and worthlessness. The camp's administration believed that terror functioned best when it was orderly, and that order required labels. Every prisoner who passed through the gates was reduced to a category, a color, a number, and a function within the system. Identity was stripped away and replaced with a symbol sewn onto fabric, visible to guards and inmates alike. Political prisoners were among the earliest groups confined in Sachsenhausen. Communists, social democrats, trade unionists, journalists, and intellectuals who had opposed the Nazi seizure of power were marked with red triangles. Many had already endured interrogations, beatings, and imprisonment elsewhere before arriving. Sachsenhausen was designed to finish the process, to break remaining resistance through isolation, exhaustion, and humiliation. These prisoners were targeted not because they posed an immediate threat, but because they represented an alternative vision of society. Their destruction was ideological. Soon, other categories followed. Criminal prisoners, identified by green triangles, were often elevated into positions of authority as capos. The SS deliberately empowered them, believing that men accustomed to violence and survival would enforce discipline without empathy. This policy was not accidental. It was engineered to divide prisoners against one another, to fracture solidarity, and to ensure that cruelty became internalized within the camp's social structure. The SS could rule indirectly while appearing distant, bureaucratic, detached. Jehovah's Witnesses arrived marked by purple triangles, imprisoned for refusing military service and pledges of loyalty to the Nazi state. Unlike other groups, they could theoretically secure release by renouncing their beliefs. Many refused. Their quiet defiance unsettled the SS, who were accustomed to obedience born of fear. Sachsenhausen became a place where such defiance was systematically punished through isolation and labor, yet their resistance persisted in silence. Homosexual men, labeled with pink triangles, were subjected to especially brutal treatment. Considered both morally corrupt and biologically dangerous by Nazi ideology, they were often assigned the most degrading labor and subjected to constant abuse. Their suffering was rarely recorded in official documents, rendering their persecution nearly invisible in post-war memory. Jewish prisoners initially arrived in smaller numbers before the war, but their treatment revealed the ideological direction the system was heading. They were frequently assigned the harshest labor, subjected to ritualized humiliation, and isolated within the camp hierarchy. Anti-Semitism was not merely tolerated, it was operational. Sachsenhausen became a testing ground for how Jewish prisoners could be dehumanized publicly, systematically, and with administrative approval. The classification system extended beyond identity into perceived usefulness. Prisoners were evaluated for labor potential. Those deemed strong were exploited. Those deemed weak were discarded. Illness became a death sentence. Injury meant selection for punishment companies or execution. The camp did not require gas chambers to function as a killing environment. Death emerged naturally from deprivation, exhaustion, and calculated neglect. Executions at Sachsenhausen during this early period were frequent, yet intentionally obscured. Some prisoners were shot under the pretense of escape attempts. Others were hanged before assembled inmates as warnings. These acts were carefully staged. The SS understood the power of spectacle. Public executions reinforced obedience not through chaos, but through demonstration. Fear was cultivated, rehearsed, and repeated. One execution site, hidden from the main camp yet central to its function, became a place where killing was routinized. Prisoners were led there individually or in groups, recorded in documents, and eliminated with efficiency. Bureaucracy transformed murder into procedure. Forms were completed. Reports were filed. The system moved on. Psychological destruction was as important as physical annihilation. Prisoners were forced to watch others suffer, unsure when their turn would come. Randomness coexisted with regulation, creating an environment where logic collapsed. Survival depended on luck, compliance, and endurance. Hope became dangerous. Attachment became liability. As the 1930s drew to a close, Sachsenhausen stood fully formed. Not yet a death camp, but something perhaps more insidious. It was a place where human beings were transformed into units of labor, discipline, and disposal. A place where SS officers learned that terror could be administered without rage, cruelty without chaos, murder without remorse. Most importantly, Sachsenhausen demonstrated that mass repression did not require secrecy. It could exist in plain sight, supported by law, language, and public indifference. The camp lay just miles from Berlin, the heart of German culture and governance. Smoke rose, trains arrived, prisoners disappeared. Life continued. By the eve of war, the lessons of Sachsenhausen were complete. The Nazis had learned how to build a system that could categorize, exploit, and eliminate people efficiently. They had trained men to administer suffering professionally. They had proven that a modern society could normalize terror without collapse. And with those lessons learned, the system was ready to expand. What began as repression was about to become annihilation. Chapter 2, Segment 1. From Model Camp to Engine of War. Sachsenhausen enters the age of extermination. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, Sachsenhausen crossed an invisible threshold. What had once been a laboratory for repression now became an operational component of a continent-wide war machine. The camp's role expanded rapidly, quietly, and with chilling efficiency. Sachsenhausen was no longer merely a place to break enemies of the state. It became a site where entire populations could be processed, exploited, and erased in service of total war. The SS did not need to invent new methods. Everything required for mass terror had already been tested within these fences. The outbreak of war brought a dramatic influx of new prisoners. Poles arrived first, intellectuals, priests, teachers, resistance figures, arrested during the campaign of decapitation, designed to destroy Polish leadership. Many were not accused of crimes. Their existence alone was deemed dangerous. They were transported to Sachsenhausen as hostages, symbols, and warnings. Their treatment was deliberate and systematic. Forced labor intensified. Beatings increased. Executions became more frequent and less concealed. The camp was adjusting its tempo. Soon after came prisoners from across occupied Europe. Resistance fighters from France and the Netherlands, political detainees from Norway and Denmark, civilians swept up in reprisals. All passed through Sachsenhausen. The camp became a clearinghouse for occupied Europe's unwanted. Language barriers dissolved under violence. Identity dissolved under uniformity. Prisoners were no longer individuals from different nations. They were raw material in a system designed to consume human life. The most catastrophic transformation occurred with the arrival of Soviet prisoners of war after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Their treatment marked a new phase in Nazi policy, one in which mass killing was no longer concealed, debated, or justified, but assumed. Soviet POWs were classified as ideological enemies and racial inferiors. They were not expected to survive. Sachsenhausen became one of the primary execution centers for Red Army captives, thousands of whom were murdered within days of arrival. A special execution facility was constructed for this purpose, designed to kill efficiently and quietly. Prisoners were told they were undergoing medical examinations. One by one, they were led into a room, measured against a wall, and shot through the neck from behind. The bodies were removed, recorded, and cremated. This method eliminated resistance, reduced noise, and preserved order. It was murder transformed into routine. The SS officers overseeing these killings were not improvising. They were perfecting procedures. They observed, adjusted, and standardized. Sachsenhausen became a training ground not just for guards, but for executioners. Techniques developed here would later appear in other camps and killing sites across the Reich. The camp's role as a prototype deepened with every corpse. Forced labor expanded in parallel with executions. Prisoners were assigned to SS-owned industries, armaments factories, brickworks, and workshops. Labor was framed as contribution to the war effort, but it was structured to destroy. Long hours, starvation rations, exposure, and constant punishment ensured that productivity and mortality rose together. Prisoners were worked until they collapsed, then replaced. Death was not a failure of the system, it was part of its design. Medical abuse also escalated during this period. Prisoners were subjected to experiments involving infectious diseases, toxic substances, and physical trauma. These experiments were justified as military research, conducted under the authority of SS doctors who viewed prisoners as expendable resources. Consent was irrelevant. Survival was incidental. The camp's medical facilities became sites of suffering where science was stripped of ethics and subordinated entirely to ideology. As the war continued, Sachsenhausen's administrative importance increased. It served as a hub for the inspection of other camps, a place where policies were tested before being exported. SS officers trained here went on to command camps throughout occupied Europe. The architecture of terror, organizational, psychological, and physical, was refined within these walls and replicated elsewhere. The surrounding German population, meanwhile, adapted. Trains arrived. Smoke rose. Rumors circulated. But Sachsenhausen operated with remarkable openness. Its existence was not hidden. Its purpose was simply normalized. This normalization was one of its greatest achievements. The camp demonstrated that mass violence could be sustained not only through fanaticism, but through routine, paperwork, and silence. By the early 1940s, Sachsenhausen had fully transformed. It was no longer merely a symbol of repression. It was an active instrument of war, genocide, and imperial domination. The SS had learned that killing could be industrialized without gas chambers, that annihilation could proceed through starvation, bullets, labor, and disease. And as the war expanded eastward, the lessons learned here would soon be applied on an even greater scale. The prototype had proven itself. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The School of Terror. How Sachsenhausen taught the SS to rule through fear. As the war intensified, Sachsenhausen evolved into something even more dangerous than a site of imprisonment or execution. It became a school, not a place of learning in the traditional sense, but a training ground where the SS perfected the techniques of domination, discipline, and destruction that would define Nazi rule across Europe. Here, cruelty was not spontaneous. It was taught, practiced, evaluated, and refined. Sachsenhausen trained the men who would later oversee ghettos, camps, and killing centers from France to the Soviet Union, exporting its methods like a curriculum of terror. The camp's proximity to Berlin was no accident. High-ranking SS officials visited regularly, observing operations and inspecting procedures. Sachsenhausen served as a showcase, a demonstration of how total control could be achieved through organization rather than chaos. Every aspect of camp life was regulated. Wake-up calls, roll calls, labor assignments, punishments, rations, and executions. Order was paramount because order made terror sustainable. Violence without structure exhausted perpetrators. Violence embedded in routine endured. SS officers in training were rotated through Sachsenhausen to observe how authority was imposed. They learned how to break prisoners without immediately killing them, how to maintain discipline through unpredictability, and how to turn prisoners against one another through hierarchies of privilege and fear. Capos, prisoners appointed to oversee others, were carefully selected and rewarded for brutality. The system ensured that survival often depended on participation in cruelty, dissolving solidarity and replacing it with suspicion. One of the most effective tools taught at Sachsenhausen was classification. Prisoners were divided into categories marked by colored triangles: political enemies, Jews, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, so-called asocials, and later Soviet prisoners of war. These labels determined food rations, labor assignments, and likelihood of survival. The system encouraged comparison and resentment, fragmenting the prisoner population. The SS learned that dehumanization worked best when victims were separated, ranked, and stripped of a shared identity. Punishment methods became increasingly standardized. Public floggings, prolonged standing, stress positions, isolation cells, and forced labor designed to be deliberately pointless, all served to reinforce absolute power. Prisoners were punished not only for disobedience, but arbitrarily, to destroy any belief in fairness or logic. At Sachsenhausen, the SS learned that terror was most effective when it appeared random, when no behavior could guarantee safety. Executions, too, were refined as instructional exercises. Hangings were often conducted publicly, forcing prisoners to watch. These spectacles were not merely acts of killing. They were lessons. They demonstrated the consequences of resistance and the futility of hope. For SS trainees, executions reinforced emotional distance. Killing became procedural. Victims became numbers. Death became administrative. Sachsenhausen also functioned as an administrative nerve center. The camp housed offices responsible for coordinating forced labor contracts, managing prisoner transfers, and overseeing subcamps throughout Germany. It was here that paperwork transformed human beings into inventory. Transport lists, labor rosters, medical reports, and death certificates flowed through filing cabinets, each document reducing a life to data. Bureaucracy became a weapon, quiet, efficient, and lethal. As Jewish persecution escalated across Europe, Sachsenhausen absorbed its role within the broader genocidal framework. Jewish prisoners were subjected to harsher labor, reduced rations, and heightened abuse. Many were selected for execution or transferred to killing centers in the East. The camp became a way station in a continent-wide system of annihilation, linking arrest, exploitation, and death. The SS personnel who passed through Sachsenhausen carried its lessons with them. They would later command camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, bringing with them the administrative discipline and psychological techniques honed here. Sachsenhausen did not merely reflect Nazi policy, it shaped it. It demonstrated that mass repression could be managed like an institution, that terror could be scaled, replicated, and maintained over time. What made Sachsenhausen especially dangerous was its normality. From the outside, it appeared orderly, efficient, almost bureaucratic. Guards went home after shifts. Reports were filed. Inspections were conducted. This banality masked the reality within the fences, where human dignity was systematically dismantled. The camp showed that genocide did not require constant frenzy. It required structure, obedience, and indifference. By the middle years of the war, Sachsenhausen had become more than a camp. It was a model for how a modern state could weaponize organization itself. The SS no longer needed to experiment. They had their blueprint, and they were ready to apply it on an unprecedented scale. The lessons learned here would soon converge with the machinery of mass extermination farther east, where killing would be accelerated beyond anything Sachsenhausen had yet seen. And yet, every system contains its fractures. Even in the most controlled environment, resistance was beginning to take shape. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Silent Defiance. Resistance, Survival, and the Limits of Total Control. Despite the SS' relentless effort to engineer absolute domination, Sachsenhausen was never a place of complete submission. Beneath the routines of roll calls, forced labor, and terror, a quieter story unfolded. One not written in orders or reports, but in whispered conversations, hidden gestures, and fragile acts of resistance that challenged the illusion of total control. Even in the camp designed to teach the SS how to rule through fear, the human instinct to resist endured. Resistance in Sachsenhausen rarely took the form of open revolt. The cost of visible defiance was immediate death, often public and exemplary. Instead, resistance emerged in subtler ways, acts that preserved dignity, protected others, or quietly undermined the system's efficiency. Prisoners shared knowledge, sabotaged production, falsified records, and passed warnings along invisible networks formed across barracks and labor details. These actions rarely changed the camp's overall machinery, but they changed lives, sometimes only for hours or days, but enough to matter. Political prisoners, many of whom had experience in underground organizing before their arrest, played a central role in these networks. Communists, social democrats, and other opponents of the regime brought with them skills in coordination and secrecy. They memorized information instead of writing it down. They used coded language. They exploited moments when guards were inattentive or divided. In some cases, they manipulated the camp's bureaucratic structure itself, altering lists to spare prisoners from lethal labor assignments or selection for execution. Medical staff imprisoned at Sachsenhausen became another quiet front of resistance. Doctors and nurses, themselves starving and abused, attempted to treat the sick with almost no supplies. They concealed illnesses during inspections, knowing that being labeled unfit often meant death. In rare cases, they falsified diagnoses to protect prisoners from transfer or execution. These acts carried enormous risk. Discovery meant torture or immediate execution, yet many continued anyway, guided by professional ethics that survived even where morality was under siege. Forced labor, intended as a tool of exhaustion and control, also became a site of defiance. Prisoners assigned to factories producing weapons or equipment deliberately slowed production, damaged components, or assembled parts incorrectly. Such sabotage was difficult to detect and dangerous to attempt, but it disrupted output and symbolized a refusal to fully serve the system that sought to destroy them. The SS responded with harsher punishments and closer surveillance, yet sabotage never disappeared, it adapted. Cultural resistance also persisted. In barracks after exhausting days, prisoners recited poetry from memory, whispered prayers, shared fragments of songs, or taught one another languages. These moments were not trivial. They reinforced identity in a place designed to erase it. The SS sought to reduce prisoners to numbers and labor units. Memory, language, and belief became weapons against that reduction. To remember who one had been and who one still was itself an act of rebellion. Jewish prisoners faced especially brutal conditions, and opportunities for organized resistance were fewer. Yet even here, defiance took shape in small but profound ways. Religious observance conducted in secret, parents protecting children as long as possible, and the refusal to abandon communal bonds despite overwhelming pressure. These actions rarely altered fate, but they challenged the camp's objective to strip victims of humanity before death. The SS were aware that resistance existed. Informants were planted among prisoners. Networks were infiltrated. Collective punishments were imposed to discourage solidarity. And yet, resistance could never be fully extinguished because it did not depend on weapons or leadership alone. It depended on choice, on the decision to act as a human being in a system that demanded obedience without conscience. What Sachsenhausen revealed unintentionally was the limitation of terror as an absolute tool. Fear could control behavior, but it could not erase thought. It could punish action, but it could not fully eliminate intention. The SS could dominate bodies, but minds and moral instincts proved harder to conquer. Even where resistance failed materially, it succeeded spiritually, preserving fragments of humanity that the system could not fully destroy. By the early 1940s, as the camp system expanded across Europe and extermination camps operated at industrial scale, Sachsenhausen remained a critical hub, not only for repression but for observation. The SS continued to refine techniques of control here, even as their ambitions grew darker and more absolute elsewhere. Yet the camp also stood as evidence that no system, no matter how meticulously engineered, could achieve total mastery over the human spirit. The blueprint of terror was powerful, but it was not perfect. And as the war moved toward its later stages, the contradictions within the system began to widen, setting the stage for chaos, collapse, and reckoning. That reckoning would come. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Labor as Control. How Sachsenhausen Turned Human Beings into Machines. By the late 1930s, Sachsenhausen had moved beyond its original role as a demonstration camp of discipline and punishment. It was becoming something far more expansive and far more revealing, a laboratory where the SS perfected the use of forced labor as a weapon. Here, labor was not primarily about productivity. It was about domination, degradation, and the systematic exhaustion of the human body until obedience became instinct and resistance felt impossible. Work was punishment, control, and slow destruction wrapped in the language of efficiency. Every prisoner who entered Sachsenhausen was assigned a work detail. Refusal was not an option. Ability was irrelevant. Men weakened by starvation, illness, or torture were driven into labor formations alongside those still physically strong. The SS believed that relentless work, combined with insufficient food and constant fear, would break prisoners faster and more completely than violence alone. Labor replaced individuality. Prisoners became units of output, measured only by their capacity to continue moving. Some work details were deliberately pointless. Prisoners were ordered to move piles of stones from one side of the camp to the other, only to be forced to move them back again the next day. Roads were built, dismantled, and rebuilt. These tasks were designed to destroy morale, to teach prisoners that effort had no meaning beyond obedience. Exhaustion was the goal. Meaninglessness was the method. Other labor assignments were explicitly lethal. Prisoners worked in brickworks, gravel pits, and construction sites where collapse, exposure, and injury were routine. Safety measures did not exist. Accidents were not investigated. A prisoner who collapsed was beaten, dragged aside, or shot. Death was not a failure of the system, it was an acceptable outcome. The SS referred to this approach as extermination through labor, a phrase that reduced murder to administrative terminology. The most infamous labor site connected to Sachsenhausen was the so-called shoe testing track. Prisoners were forced to march for hours each day along a loop of different surfaces: gravel, sand, stone, and concrete, while wearing prototype military boots weighted with heavy packs. Many were already starving. Feet bled, bones fractured, Muskelstore. Those who fell behind were beaten. Those who collapsed were removed from the track and often never seen again. The experiment was not designed to help prisoners survive. It was designed to maximize endurance until bodies failed. As the German war economy expanded, Sachsenhausen became increasingly integrated into industrial production. Workshops inside the camp manufactured furniture, uniforms, and military equipment. Outside the camp, satellite labor sites were established, where prisoners were sent to work in armaments factories, quarries, and construction projects that supported the Reich's infrastructure. Private companies benefited directly from this system, paying the SS for prisoner labor while remaining insulated from responsibility for conditions inside the camp. The SS carefully monitored labor output, but productivity was always secondary to control. When production slowed due to illness or death, replacements were simply requested. Human beings were treated as disposable components. The camp's administrative records tracked prisoners with the same detached precision used to track materials. Losses were noted, not mourned. Forced labor also reinforced the internal hierarchy among prisoners. Certain positions, clerks, foremen, or camp functionaries, were granted marginal privileges in exchange for enforcing discipline on others. This system fractured solidarity and forced prisoners into impossible moral compromises. Survival often depended on proximity to power, however limited. The SS understood this dynamic well and exploited it deliberately, using prisoners to police prisoners while maintaining ultimate authority. Jewish prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and other groups deemed racially or politically inferior were assigned the most brutal labor assignments. Mortality among these groups was especially high. Labor became a sorting mechanism. Those who could endure were temporarily preserved, while those who could not were removed through death, execution, or transfer. By the early 1940s, Sachsenhausen was no longer just a model of terror. It was a fully functioning engine of exploitation. The camp demonstrated how ideology, bureaucracy, and economic ambition could merge into a single system where cruelty was normalized and suffering was profitable. The SS learned not only how to punish through work, but how to extract value from destruction itself. Yet even here, where labor was designed to erase will, the system revealed its own contradictions. Overworked prisoners became inefficient. Disease spread rapidly through exhausted bodies. The drive for total exploitation undermined long-term productivity. The SS responded not by easing conditions, but by accelerating replacement. The solution to human collapse was not care, it was more prisoners. Sachsenhausen had become a proving ground for an idea that would soon be exported across occupied Europe, that a human life could be consumed completely, body, labor, and dignity, without ever requiring a gas chamber. And as the war deepened, this model would be scaled up, refined, and pushed to its limits. The machinery was already in motion. Chapter 3, Segment 2. The clinical face of cruelty. Medicine, experimentation, and the normalization of suffering. In Sachsenhausen, cruelty did not always arrive with shouting or blows. Often it arrived quietly, wearing a white coat, carrying a clipboard, speaking in the language of science. Within the camp, medicine was transformed from a profession dedicated to healing into a tool of domination, experimentation, and bureaucratic murder. Doctors did not stand apart from the system of terror. They helped design it, legitimize it, and refine it. The camp infirmary, known as the Revier, was not a place of refuge. For many prisoners, it was a threshold between survival and death. Admission depended not on medical need, but on perceived usefulness. Prisoners deemed too weak to work were often denied care entirely. Those admitted were subjected to cursory examinations, minimal treatment, and constant fear, because selection for execution or experimentation could occur at any moment. SS doctors stationed at Sachsenhausen were trained not only in medicine, but in ideology. They believed that human worth could be measured biologically, racially, and economically. This belief allowed them to rationalize abuse as research and murder as necessity. Under their supervision, prisoners became test subjects, anonymous bodies stripped of identity and reduced to data points. One of the most notorious programs involved medical experiments conducted on prisoners without consent. Infectious diseases such as hepatitis, typhus, and tuberculosis were deliberately introduced to observe progression and test potential treatments. Prisoners were injected, monitored, and often left untreated as symptoms worsened. Pain was recorded. Death was expected. Survival was incidental. Other experiments focused on physical endurance and trauma. Prisoners were subjected to exposure tests, forced to stand naked in freezing conditions for extended periods while doctors observed the body's response. Hypothermia experiments aimed to determine how long a human could survive cold exposure and how quickly revival might be possible, information intended for military use. Many subjects died during these trials. Others were killed afterward to conceal the results. Sterilization experiments were also carried out, reflecting the regime's obsession with racial purity. Prisoners were exposed to radiation or injected with caustic chemicals designed to destroy reproductive organs. These procedures caused intense pain, permanent injury, and death. The goal was not treatment, but the development of mass sterilization techniques that could be deployed efficiently. What made Sachsenhausen especially significant was not just the brutality of these experiments, but their institutional acceptance. Reports were filed. Results were forwarded to higher authorities. Conferences were held. The language used was technical, detached, and precise. Suffering was translated into statistics. Atrocities were reframed as progress. Doctors collaborated closely with camp administrators and SS officers. Medical decisions were integrated into labor management, punishment, and execution schedules. A prisoner's medical condition could determine whether they were assigned lighter work, transferred, experimented upon, or killed. Medicine became another layer of control, one that appeared rational and orderly, even as it destroyed lives. The process of selection exemplified this fusion of science and terror. During periodic inspections, doctors assessed prisoners quickly, often with a glance. Those marked as unfit were separated and removed. Some were sent to killing centers under the so-called euthanasia program. Others were executed within the camp. The criteria were vague, flexible, and entirely at the discretion of the SS. Even death itself was medicalized. Causes were falsified in records to conceal murder. Starvation became heart failure. Beatings became pneumonia. Executions were recorded as natural deaths. These false diagnoses protected perpetrators and obscured responsibility, allowing the system to function without interruption. For prisoners, the presence of doctors did not bring reassurance. It brought dread. The white coat became a symbol not of care, but of judgment. A visit to the infirmary could mean a temporary reprieve or a final sentence. Survival often depended on appearing strong enough to work, but not strong enough to attract attention. Yet even within this machinery, there were moments, rare and fragile, where individual doctors or prisoner medics attempted to mitigate harm. Some falsified records to save lives. Others shared medicines secretly or delayed selections. These acts did not dismantle the system, but they revealed that choice still existed, even within extreme constraint. Sachsenhausen demonstrated how easily medicine could be corrupted when ethics were subordinated to ideology. The camp became a training ground not only for SS officers, but for a worldview in which healing and killing were no longer opposites. They were points on the same administrative spectrum. What emerged from this environment was a chilling lesson, one that would echo across the Nazi camp system. That cruelty could be made efficient, respectable, and routine when framed as science. And once suffering was normalized in this way, there were few limits left to cross. Chapter 3, Segment 3. The Architecture of Death. Punishment, Execution, and the Systemization of Terror. In Sachsenhausen, death was not chaotic. It was organized, rehearsed, and refined. The camp did not rely on spontaneous violence alone. It built an entire structure around punishment and execution, transforming killing into an administrative process. Here, terror was not merely inflicted. It was designed, measured, and perfected. Every punishment served a purpose, every execution sent a message, and every death reinforced the authority of the system. Punishment in Sachsenhausen followed strict rules, yet those rules were endlessly flexible in the hands of the SS. Infractions could be real or imagined. A slow pace at work, a glance held too long, a failure to salute correctly. Any of these could result in severe consequences. The ambiguity itself was intentional. Prisoners never knew what behavior might provoke violence, and that uncertainty bred constant fear. One of the most infamous punishment devices was the punishment post. Prisoners were suspended by their arms, tied behind their backs, often for hours. The strain dislocated shoulders, cut off circulation, and caused excruciating pain. SS guards observed calmly, sometimes taking notes, sometimes smoking cigarettes. The suffering was visible, public, and deliberate. It was meant to be seen. Public punishments were staged performances. Prisoners were forced to witness beatings, floggings, and hangings. Attendance was mandatory. The goal was not only to punish the victim, but to discipline the observers. Fear was collective. Silence was enforced. Resistance was broken not just through pain, but through spectacle. Executions in Sachsenhausen were carried out with similar precision. The camp developed multiple methods, each chosen for efficiency and secrecy. Prisoners were shot in specially designed facilities, including a concealed execution trench and a shooting gallery disguised as a medical examination room. Victims were told they were undergoing routine measurements. A gunshot to the back of the neck ended their lives without warning. Hanging was also used, often as a public display. Gallows were erected within the camp, and executions were announced in advance. Prisoners were marched past the bodies afterward, forced to confront the consequences of defiance. These rituals were not acts of rage. They were calculated demonstrations of power. What made Sachsenhausen especially significant was how these methods were standardized. Procedures were written down. Timings were optimized. Roles were assigned. Guards were trained not only in how to kill, but how to do so efficiently, cleanly, and without emotional involvement. Execution became routine work. This normalization of killing extended to record-keeping. Deaths were logged with false causes. Executions were disguised as illness or accidents. The bureaucracy absorbed murder seamlessly. Paperwork continued. Shifts changed. Meals were eaten. Life inside the camp went on as death occurred alongside it. Sachsenhausen also functioned as a testing ground for execution techniques later used elsewhere. Methods refined here were exported to other camps across the Reich. Officers trained in Sachsenhausen carried their experience and their desensitization with them. The camp became a classroom for cruelty. For prisoners, survival meant navigating an environment where the rules were designed to fail them. Obedience did not guarantee safety. Strength could attract harsher labor. Weakness could mean death. The system was engineered to grind people down physically and psychologically until compliance became instinctive. Yet even in this environment, acts of defiance occurred. Some prisoners sabotaged work assignments. Others shared food, information, or quiet words of encouragement. These acts were small, often invisible, but they represented a refusal to be fully consumed by the system. The SS responded with harsher punishments, reinforcing the cycle of control. As the years passed, the killing infrastructure of Sachsenhausen became increasingly efficient. What began as repression evolved into extermination. Political prisoners, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and others deemed undesirable were eliminated not in bursts of violence, but through steady, methodical processes. By the time the camp reached its peak operation, death no longer shocked the guards. It was expected. It was scheduled. It was part of the daily rhythm. This, more than any single atrocity, revealed the true nature of Sachsenhausen, not as a place of uncontrolled brutality, but as a factory of terror where human life was reduced to a variable in an equation of power. And it was this equation, tested, refined, and perfected here, that would soon be applied on a far greater scale. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Forced Labor and the Economy of Terror. By the late 1930s, Sachsenhausen had evolved beyond a site of confinement and punishment. It became an engine, one designed to extract value from human beings until nothing remained. Forced labor was not an afterthought of the camp system. It was one of its central pillars. In Sachsenhausen, terror and productivity were fused, creating an economy that thrived on exhaustion, starvation, and death. From the beginning, the SS understood that prisoners could be exploited as a captive workforce. What distinguished Sachsenhausen was how deliberately this exploitation was organized. The camp's proximity to Berlin made it ideal for testing how forced labor could be integrated into the broader Nazi economy. Ministries, private firms, and SS-owned enterprises all drew from the camp's labor pool, transforming suffering into profit. Prisoners were assigned to work details immediately upon arrival. There was no period of adjustment. Men weakened by transport, hunger, and fear were marched directly into labor commands that demanded relentless physical exertion. Quarries, brickworks, construction sites, workshops, and armament factories all relied on prisoner labor. Workdays often lasted 12 hours or more, regardless of weather, illness, or injury. One of the most infamous labor sites connected to Sachsenhausen was the brickworks at Klinkerwerk, located along the Havel River. There, prisoners were forced to produce bricks intended for Hitler's grand architectural visions of a rebuilt Berlin. The work was brutal. Heavy clay was hauled by hand. Kilns burned relentlessly. Exhaustion was constant. Many prisoners collapsed on the job and were beaten for slowing down production. Food rations were intentionally insufficient. Calories were calculated not to sustain life, but to weaken it gradually. Prisoners were expected to perform heavy labor while starving. Weight loss was rapid. Muscles wasted away. Those who could no longer keep pace were labeled unfit and reassigned to even harsher duties, or removed entirely. The SS monitored productivity closely. Output was measured. Quotas were enforced. Failure to meet expectations resulted in punishment. Labor became another mechanism of discipline. Work itself was a form of torture, and punishment for inadequate work intensified that suffering. The system ensured that prisoners were always failing, always vulnerable. Medical care was minimal and often cruel. Injuries sustained during labor were rarely treated properly. Infections spread quickly. Broken bones went untreated. Prisoners with visible injuries were sometimes accused of sabotage or malingering. The camp hospital, or Revier, offered little refuge. For many, it became a waiting room for death. As the war expanded, Sachsenhausen's labor system grew more complex. Prisoners were sent to satellite camps and external work sites across Germany. Armament production increased. The camp became a reservoir of disposable labor fueling the war effort. The SS negotiated contracts with private companies, earning revenue while avoiding responsibility for worker welfare. If a prisoner died, another was simply assigned. This system blurred the line between imprisonment and extermination. While Sachsenhausen was not initially designed as a death camp, forced labor became a means of killing. Prisoners were worked until their bodies failed. Death came from exhaustion, disease, malnutrition, or execution once they were no longer useful. The phrase extermination through labor was not metaphorical. It was policy. What made this system particularly insidious was its bureaucratic efficiency. Paperwork documented labor assignments, production figures, and disciplinary actions. The suffering of prisoners was reduced to numbers on reports. Administrators discussed output, not lives. The language of management masked the reality of cruelty. SS officers overseeing labor commands were trained to suppress empathy. Prisoners were referred to as units, not people. Losses were expected and accepted. In this environment, moral responsibility dissolved into procedure. Orders were followed. Reports were filed. The machine kept moving. Yet within this system, moments of resistance persisted. Prisoners sabotaged machinery when they could. Tools were damaged subtly. Work was slowed whenever possible. These acts were dangerous and often punished severely, but they represented quiet defiance against an economy built on suffering. As Sachsenhausen's labor program expanded, it further solidified the camp's role as a prototype. The methods developed here, calculated starvation, relentless work schedules, integration with industry, were exported across the camp network. Other camps followed the Sachsenhausen model, replicating its balance of terror and productivity. By the early 1940s, forced labor had become inseparable from the identity of Sachsenhausen. It was no longer just a place where people were held and punished. It was a factory of exhaustion, where human life was consumed to fuel ideology, ambition, and war. And as the demands of the Nazi state increased, the pace of destruction only accelerated, drawing Sachsenhausen ever closer to becoming not just a model camp, but a machine designed to grind human beings into silence. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Medicine turned into a weapon. Experimentation and pseudoscience at Sachsenhausen. Within the perimeter of Sachsenhausen, medicine did not exist to heal. It existed to control, to test, and ultimately to destroy. What should have been a discipline dedicated to preserving life was reshaped into a tool of domination, stripped of ethics and bent entirely to the needs of the Nazi state. In this camp, scientific language and clinical routines were used to mask cruelty, transforming human beings into raw material for experimentation. From its earliest years, Sachsenhausen became a proving ground not only for SS discipline, but for medical practices that rejected the most basic principles of humanity. Doctors stationed at the camp were not outsiders acting in isolation. They were trained professionals, men with degrees, uniforms, and authority, who believed their work served a higher racial and ideological purpose. Under this belief, prisoners were no longer patients. They were subjects. Medical experiments at Sachsenhausen were conducted systematically. Prisoners were selected based on category, physical condition, or perceived usefulness. Consent was never sought. Refusal was impossible. The victims were often political prisoners, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, or those already weakened by forced labor and starvation. Their suffering was considered acceptable, even necessary. One of the earliest and most extensive programs involved testing treatments for infectious diseases. Typhus, which spread rapidly through overcrowded camps, became both a threat and an opportunity for SS doctors. Prisoners were deliberately infected, sometimes through injections, sometimes through exposure to lice. Experimental vaccines and drugs were then administered in uncontrolled trials. Many subjects died from the disease itself. Others died from the so-called treatments. The conditions under which these experiments were conducted ensured failure. Starvation weakened immune systems. Sanitation was non-existent. Recovery was unlikely. Yet the results were recorded meticulously. Charts were filled. Reports were sent. The suffering was reduced to data points. Another category of experimentation focused on physical endurance and trauma. Prisoners were subjected to extreme stress tests, exposure to freezing temperatures, prolonged standing, deprivation of sleep, and deliberate injury. These experiments were often justified as necessary for military research, supposedly to help German soldiers survive harsh conditions at the front. In reality, they were exercises in cruelty, designed without regard for survival. Surgical experiments were also carried out without anesthesia. Bones were broken and reset improperly. Organs were removed. Wounds were deliberately infected. Prisoners screamed or went into shock, restrained by guards while doctors observed. Those who survived were often left permanently disabled, returned to labor until they collapsed, or killed to conceal the evidence. Perhaps most disturbing was the routine nature of these crimes. Experiments were scheduled. Assistants prepared instruments. Guards escorted prisoners as if to a work detail. The process was normalized. Violence was no longer chaotic, it was organized, professional, and bureaucratic. The camp infirmary, which should have represented refuge, became a place of fear. Prisoners avoided it whenever possible, knowing that admission could mean selection for experimentation or death by lethal injection. The white coats of doctors inspired terror equal to that of SS uniforms. Medical staff worked closely with camp administrators. Those deemed unfit for labor were reported. Decisions about life and death were made under the guise of medical judgment. Prisoners labeled as incurable or non-productive were often transferred for execution. Medicine became a gatekeeper to survival, and it consistently chose death. What made Sachsenhausen particularly significant was its role as a training center. SS doctors who practiced here were later sent to other camps, carrying with them the methods refined within these walls. The procedures, classifications, and moral detachment developed at Sachsenhausen spread across the camp system. The atrocities committed here became templates. Scientific institutions outside the camp were complicit. Universities, research institutes, and pharmaceutical companies received reports and results. Few asked how the data had been obtained. Many accepted it eagerly. The boundary between academic science and mass murder dissolved. Language played a critical role in sustaining this system. Experiments were described as research. Killings were recorded as euthanasia or special treatment. Bureaucratic phrasing concealed reality, allowing perpetrators to distance themselves psychologically from their actions. The victims disappeared behind words. For the prisoners, resistance was almost impossible. Some attempted to feign illness to avoid experiments. Others tried to sabotage trials by hiding symptoms or contaminating samples. These acts were dangerous and rarely successful, but they represented the last remnants of agency in a system designed to strip it away. By the height of the war, medical abuse at Sachsenhausen had become routine. It was no longer shocking to those who carried it out. Doctors ate meals after experiments. Guards joked. Paperwork was completed. The machinery of terror functioned smoothly. This transformation of medicine into a weapon stands as one of the most chilling aspects of Sachsenhausen's legacy. It demonstrated how education, authority, and science, when divorced from ethics, could be harnessed to commit atrocities on an unprecedented scale. Sachsenhausen did not merely reflect Nazi cruelty. It taught it. It institutionalized it. And through its medical programs, it proved that genocide did not require hatred alone. It required systems, professionals, and the willingness to abandon moral limits. In the next segment, this system of controlled cruelty will expand further, as we examine executions, punishment regimes, and how death itself was standardized inside Sachsenhausen, not as chaos but as procedure. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Death as Procedure. Execution, punishment, and the standardization of killing at Sachsenhausen. At Sachsenhausen, death was not spontaneous. It was scheduled, processed, and recorded. By the time the camp reached its full operational maturity, killing had become an administrative function, one more task managed by orders, reports, and trained personnel. Violence was no longer the result of rage or chaos. It was methodical, repeatable, and efficient. This was where the Nazis perfected the idea that murder could be standardized. Executions at Sachsenhausen took many forms, each designed for a specific category of prisoner and a specific bureaucratic purpose. Some deaths were meant to punish, others to intimidate, many simply to remove those deemed useless. Together, they formed a system where life and death were governed by procedure rather than conscience. Public executions were among the most visible tools of terror. Prisoners were forced to assemble in roll call yards, standing for hours while selected individuals were beaten, hanged, or shot before their eyes. These killings were not spontaneous acts of cruelty, they were performances. The SS understood that fear could be amplified by making death visible. One execution could control thousands. Hanging was commonly used for those accused of sabotage, resistance, escape attempts, or defiance. Makeshift gallows were erected in plain view. Prisoners were sometimes forced to watch friends or comrades die slowly, struggling for breath as guards looked on. Silence was mandatory. Any sign of emotion could lead to punishment or selection for death. Shooting was reserved for mass executions, especially of Soviet prisoners of war. Thousands were brought to Sachsenhausen after the invasion of the Soviet Union. Many were never registered as inmates. Instead, they were led directly to execution sites. One of the most infamous was the so-called Station Z, a purpose-built killing facility designed specifically for executions. Station Z represented the transformation of murder into infrastructure. It included a firing range disguised as a medical examination room. Prisoners were told they would have their height measured. Instead, they were shot in the neck through a concealed opening in the wall. Their bodies fell forward out of sight. The process could be repeated rapidly, one victim after another, with minimal effort and no witnesses. This method was chosen not only for efficiency, but for psychological distance. The executioner did not have to look into the victim's eyes. The killing became mechanical, a trigger pulled, a body removed, a record filed. Other prisoners were killed through lethal injections, particularly those deemed too weak to work or labeled as mentally ill. These murders were recorded as medical procedures. Doctors administered injections of phenol or other substances directly into the heart. Death followed within minutes. The body was then sent to the crematorium. Punishment short of execution was designed to break bodies and spirits until death became inevitable. Prisoners were subjected to brutal disciplinary regimes. Standing cells where inmates were forced to remain upright for days. Beatings with truncheons and whips. Suspension by the arms behind the back, which dislocated shoulders and tore muscles. Many died not during the punishment itself, but days later from internal injuries. One of the most notorious punishment areas was the camp's shoe testing track. Prisoners were forced to march for hours or days wearing shoes of different designs, carrying heavy loads. This was ostensibly to test footwear for the German military. In reality, it was forced labor designed to kill through exhaustion. Men collapsed, were beaten to their feet, and collapsed again. Some never rose. Starvation functioned as a slow execution method. Food rations were deliberately insufficient. Those who could no longer work were marked for death. The line between punishment and execution disappeared. Weakness itself became a crime. Executions were documented with precision. Dates, numbers, and categories were recorded. Reports were sent up the chain of command. The language used was sterile: special treatment, transport, processing. Words replaced reality, allowing those responsible to distance themselves from the act of killing. What made Sachsenhausen uniquely important was not just the scale of death, but its role as a training ground. SS personnel learned here how to kill efficiently, how to maintain order through terror, and how to manage large populations through fear. These methods were then exported to other camps. Sachsenhausen taught the system how to function. Even the crematoria were part of this standardization. Bodies were burned continuously. Ashes were disposed of without ceremony. Death left no trace. The camp was designed not only to kill but to erase. For prisoners, the knowledge that death could come at any moment, and for any reason, created a constant state of terror. Survival depended on obedience, luck, and invisibility. One misstep, one accusation, one moment of weakness could mean selection for execution. By the later years of the war, killing at Sachsenhausen had become routine. Guards no longer reacted emotionally. Doctors signed death certificates. Administrators processed numbers. The system functioned as intended. This was the true horror of Sachsenhausen. Not just cruelty, but normalization. Murder became part of daily operations. It was no longer exceptional, it was expected. In the next chapter, the focus will shift from how Sachsenhausen killed to who was forced to endure it, examining the categories of prisoners, the hierarchies imposed among them, and how the Nazis used division as another weapon of control. Chapter 5, Segment 1. A Society of Prisoners. Categories, hierarchy, and division as a weapon. Inside Sachsenhausen, the SS did not rule through force alone. They ruled through structure. The camp was not just a place of imprisonment. It was a carefully engineered social system designed to fracture solidarity, cultivate mistrust, and turn prisoners against one another. From the moment inmates arrived, they were sorted, labeled, and ranked, their identities reduced to colored triangles sewn onto striped uniforms. These symbols determined not only how prisoners were treated by the guards, but how they were treated by each other. Sachsenhausen was a society built on enforced division, and it functioned exactly as the SS intended. Every prisoner was assigned a category. Political prisoners wore red triangles. Jews were marked with yellow stars or overlapping triangles. Criminal prisoners were labeled with green. Jehovah's Witnesses wore purple. Homosexual men were forced to wear pink. Roma prisoners were marked with black triangles, a category also used for those the Nazis deemed asocial. Each color carried meaning, stigma, and consequence. These classifications were not incidental. They were foundational to how the camp operated. Political prisoners were often among the first inmates. Many had been arrested in the early years of Nazi rule: communists, social democrats, trade unionists, intellectuals. They were considered ideological enemies of the state and were often subjected to harsh interrogation and punishment. Yet paradoxically, some political prisoners later gained limited authority within the camp, serving as functionaries under SS supervision. This created moral dilemmas that would haunt survivors long after the war. Criminal prisoners, marked by green triangles, occupied a unique and controversial position. The SS frequently elevated them to roles such as capos, prisoner overseers responsible for enforcing discipline in barracks and work details. The reasoning was deliberate. Criminal prisoners, often hardened by previous incarceration and less likely to sympathize with political or Jewish inmates, were seen as effective instruments of control. Given power, food privileges, and protection, many capos became brutal enforcers, replicating SS violence within the prisoner population. Jewish prisoners faced the most extreme persecution. They were subjected to additional humiliation, harsher labor, and higher mortality rates. In Sachsenhausen, as in other camps, anti-Semitic ideology translated into daily cruelty. Jews were frequently assigned the most exhausting tasks, denied access to positions of authority, and targeted for punishment. As the Holocaust intensified, Jewish prisoners were increasingly selected for deportation to extermination camps or executed within Sachsenhausen itself. The system of hierarchy extended beyond categories into an internal ranking among prisoners. Senior inmates held positions of influence: block elders, work detail leaders, clerks. These roles offered marginally better conditions. Slightly more food, reduced physical labor, limited protection. But they came at a cost. Functionaries were expected to maintain order, meet quotas, and report infractions. Failure meant punishment or death. Compliance meant complicity. This structure placed prisoners in impossible positions. To survive, some were forced to enforce rules that harmed others. To protect their barracks, they sometimes had to sacrifice individuals. The SS exploited these dynamics expertly, ensuring that blame and resentment flowed horizontally among prisoners rather than upward toward the true perpetrators. Division was reinforced through scarcity. Food was never sufficient. Clothing was inadequate. Space was overcrowded. In such conditions, competition replaced solidarity. A crust of bread could mean survival for one person and death for another. Theft, betrayal, and silence became survival strategies. Trust was dangerous. Kindness was risky. Language itself became a tool of control. Prisoners learned camp terminology, commands, punishments, procedures. Speaking incorrectly could result in beatings. Silence was safer. Knowledge became currency, but sharing it could endanger both giver and receiver. Yet within this fractured society, moments of humanity persisted. Political prisoners sometimes formed clandestine support networks. Jewish inmates shared scraps of food, whispered prayers, or offered comfort in secret. Jehovah's Witnesses refused to renounce their faith despite brutal punishment. Acts of resistance were often small and quiet, sharing information, sabotaging work, preserving dignity in the face of systematic degradation. Children, though fewer in number at Sachsenhausen than in extermination camps, existed at the margins. Hidden, protected when possible, or forced into labor beyond their strength. Elderly prisoners were particularly vulnerable, often unable to meet work demands and quickly marked for death. The SS observed all of this with calculated detachment. The prisoner society they had engineered functioned efficiently. Violence did not always require guards. Order did not require constant supervision. The system sustained itself through fear and necessity. What made Sachsenhausen especially significant was how this model was studied and replicated. SS officers trained here learned how to manage prisoner populations through hierarchy and division. They observed which structures produced compliance, which incentives encouraged brutality, and which forms of deprivation broke resistance fastest. These lessons were carried to camps across the Reich. In the end, Sachsenhausen was not only a place where people were imprisoned, it was a laboratory of social destruction. Identity was weaponized. Community was dismantled. Survival was made conditional upon moral compromise. And yet, even here, the system never fully succeeded. Bonds formed despite everything. Memory survived. Testimony endured. In the next segment, the focus will turn to forced labor and economic exploitation, how Sachsenhausen became not only a site of terror, but a node in the Nazi war economy, extracting value from human suffering until bodies were no longer usable. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Work until death. Forced labor, economic exploitation, and the industrialization of suffering. At Sachsenhausen, labor was not a means of productivity alone. It was a method of punishment, control, and slow execution. The SS believed that work could be used to break bodies and spirits simultaneously, extracting economic value from prisoners while ensuring that survival remained temporary. The camp's forced labor system became one of its most defining features, transforming Sachsenhausen into both a terror site and an integral component of the Nazi economy. Every task, every work detail, every quota was designed with a single principle in mind. Prisoners were expendable resources. From dawn until nightfall, inmates were driven into labor details under constant threat of violence. The workday often began before sunrise, with roll calls that lasted hours regardless of weather. Prisoners stood motionless in freezing cold or pouring rain, watching bodies collapse beside them, knowing that fainting could result in beatings or execution. Only after the SS were satisfied with the count were prisoners marched to their assigned labor sites. Early labor at Sachsenhausen focused on camp construction itself. Prisoners built barracks, roads, fences, watchtowers, and administrative buildings, literally constructing the machinery of their own imprisonment. As the camp expanded, so did the scope of forced labor. Stone quarries, brickworks, workshops, and armament factories became central to daily life. The SS quickly realized that Sachsenhausen's proximity to Berlin made it ideal for supplying labor to state projects and private industry alike. One of the most notorious labor details was the brickworks, where prisoners were forced to carry heavy loads of clay and bricks for hours on end. The work was exhausting, monotonous, and relentless. Malnutrition made even standing difficult, yet prisoners were expected to maintain impossible output levels. Those who slowed were beaten. Those who collapsed were dragged aside and often never returned. Another infamous punishment was the shoe testing track, a circular path with varying surfaces, gravel, stone, sand, asphalt, designed to test military footwear. Prisoners were forced to march this track for up to 40 kilometers a day, carrying heavy packs, wearing ill-fitting shoes. The purpose was not only product testing, it was deliberate torture. Feet bled, bones fractured, infections spread. Many prisoners died on the track or were later executed when they could no longer walk. As the war progressed, Sachsenhausen became increasingly integrated into Germany's war economy. Armaments production expanded. Prisoners were forced to assemble weapons, aircraft parts, and military equipment for the Reich. Factories operated under SS supervision, with productivity targets enforced through terror. Sabotage was punishable by death, yet some prisoners risked everything to damage equipment or slow production. Small acts of resistance that carried enormous risk. Private companies benefited directly from this system. Contracts were signed between the SS and German firms, allowing businesses to rent prisoner labor at minimal cost. Human beings were reduced to line items on balance sheets. If a worker died, replacements arrived. The camp administration tracked labor output with the same bureaucratic precision used to track deaths. Food rations were calibrated not to sustain life, but to maintain temporary functionality. A watery soup, a piece of bread, sometimes a sliver of sausage, never enough to replenish the calories burned during labor. Prisoners became walking skeletons, their bodies consuming themselves to survive another day. Illness spread rapidly. Injuries went untreated. Those deemed unfit for work were selected for execution or transferred to other camps where death came faster. Medical care existed only in name. The camp infirmary often served as a sorting center for death rather than healing. Prisoners sent there frequently disappeared, killed by lethal injection, starvation, or neglect. Doctors participated in selections, determining who was still useful and who was not. In some cases, medical experiments were conducted, further blurring the line between labor exploitation and scientific abuse. The SS justified this system through ideology. Prisoners were labeled enemies, subhuman, undeserving of mercy. Work was framed as both punishment and redemption, though redemption was never truly possible. Even those who met quotas, even those who followed rules, remained disposable. What made Sachsenhausen especially significant was how this labor system was studied and replicated. SS officers trained here learned how to maximize output while minimizing survival. They observed how hunger increased compliance, how exhaustion reduced resistance, and how terror maintained order. These lessons were exported to camps across occupied Europe, making Sachsenhausen a template not only for imprisonment, but for industrialized exploitation. Yet even within this machinery of suffering, prisoners found ways to resist. Skilled workers sometimes manipulated measurements. Clerks altered records. Mechanics loosened bolts. These acts rarely changed outcomes, but they preserved a sense of agency in a system designed to erase it. Resistance did not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it was simply the refusal to become what the system demanded. By the later years of the war, the labor system began to collapse under its own weight. Allied bombing disrupted production. Supply chains failed. Prisoner populations swelled as evacuations from other camps flooded Sachsenhausen. Work details became chaotic, conditions worsened, and death rates soared. Forced labor at Sachsenhausen was never about victory alone. It was about control, profit, and destruction woven together. The camp demonstrated how modern industry could be fused with ideology to create a system where exploitation and extermination reinforced one another. In the next segment, the focus will shift to discipline and punishment, the daily rituals of violence, surveillance, and fear that enforced this labor system and ensured that terror remained constant, even when the guards were absent. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Terror as Routine, Discipline, Punishment, and the Architecture of Fear. At Sachsenhausen, discipline was not simply enforced, it was engineered. Punishment was woven into every hour of camp life, transforming fear into a constant presence that governed behavior even when guards were not visibly present. The SS understood that terror worked best when it became predictable, ritualized, and inescapable. Violence was not random chaos. It was systematized instruction. Every punishment carried a lesson, and every lesson was meant to be witnessed. From the moment prisoners entered the camp, they were subjected to an environment designed to erase individuality and autonomy. Roll calls were the foundation of this system. Conducted twice daily and often lasting for hours, roll calls were less about counting prisoners than asserting dominance. Prisoners were forced to stand at attention in rows, regardless of weather, illness, or injury. Collapsing from exhaustion or hypothermia was treated as defiance. Those who fell were beaten, sometimes to death, in front of the assembled camp. The message was unmistakable. Survival depended on obedience, not humanity. Punishment at Sachsenhausen followed a graduated scale, though even the mildest penalties were brutal. Minor infractions, talking during work, stepping out of line, failing to meet quotas, could result in beatings with batons, whips, or rifle butts. These beatings were often carried out publicly, ensuring that pain became a collective experience. The SS rarely needed to explain the reason. The spectacle itself was sufficient. More severe punishments were designed to humiliate, disable, or kill slowly. One of the most infamous methods was the tree or post punishment, where prisoners were suspended by their wrists behind their backs, often for hours. The strain dislocated shoulders, tore muscles, and caused permanent nerve damage. Screams echoed through the camp, audible reminders of the consequences of disobedience. Some prisoners lost consciousness. Others never recovered full use of their arms. Solitary confinement was another tool of control. Prisoners were locked in tiny, dark cells with little food, water, or air circulation. Days or weeks in isolation shattered mental resilience. Many emerged disoriented, broken, or suicidal. The SS understood that psychological destruction was as effective as physical harm. The camp also maintained execution facilities that functioned with chilling efficiency. A small, nondescript building housed a shooting range disguised as a medical examination room. Prisoners were led inside under false pretenses and killed with a shot to the back of the neck. Others were hanged publicly as deterrents, their bodies left on display while prisoners were forced to march past. These executions were meticulously recorded, reduced to bureaucratic entries that concealed the violence behind paperwork. Medical punishment blurred the line between discipline and experimentation. Camp doctors participated actively in selections and abuse. Prisoners deemed weak, unproductive, or undesirable were removed under the guise of medical treatment. Some were subjected to lethal injections. Others were used in experiments that inflicted pain, infection, or death. The white coat became another symbol of terror. Informants and internal surveillance amplified fear. The SS cultivated prisoner functionaries, capos, who were given authority over others in exchange for privileges. This system fractured solidarity, turning victims into instruments of control. Capos enforced discipline with brutality, often exceeding SS violence to maintain their positions. Trust eroded. Silence became survival. The physical layout of Sachsenhausen reinforced this regime. Barracks were arranged in fan-shaped formation around a central roll call square, allowing guards to observe prisoners constantly. Watchtowers, fences, and lighting eliminated darkness as refuge. Even at night, the camp remained exposed, illuminated, and controlled. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to rest from scrutiny. Punishment extended beyond the individual to entire groups. Collective penalties were imposed when sabotage or escape was suspected. Entire barracks were deprived of food, forced to stand for hours, or subjected to random beatings. Guilt was communal, innocence irrelevant. This tactic ensured that prisoners policed one another, reinforcing the SS authority without constant intervention. What made Sachsenhausen especially significant was how this disciplinary system was studied and refined. SS officers trained here learned how fear could be standardized. They observed how punishment rituals maintained order, how unpredictability increased compliance, and how cruelty could be normalized among perpetrators. These lessons were later applied across the camp network, making Sachsenhausen a laboratory for terror. Yet even within this suffocating environment, moments of defiance existed. Some prisoners refused to cry out during beatings. Others shared food, whispered prayers, or exchanged looks of solidarity during roll calls. These acts did not dismantle the system, but they preserved fragments of humanity that punishment sought to erase. As the war progressed and conditions deteriorated, discipline became more chaotic and lethal. Overcrowding, shortages, and panic intensified violence. Punishments escalated. Executions increased. The SS, sensing the approaching collapse of the Reich, unleashed brutality with fewer restraints. By the time Sachsenhausen neared its final phase, terror had fully replaced administration. Punishment was no longer corrective. It was exterminatory. The camp revealed how discipline, when stripped of moral limits and fused with ideology, becomes a weapon capable of destroying not just bodies, but the very idea of justice. In the next chapter, the focus will shift to medical abuse and pseudoscientific cruelty, how Sachsenhausen became a site where doctors and administrators collaborated to transform suffering into data and murder into research, further perfecting the machinery of Nazi terror. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The Laboratory of Dehumanization. Medical Abuse and Pseudoscience at Sachsenhausen. At Sachsenhausen, murder did not always arrive with a gunshot or a whip. Sometimes it came wearing a white coat. The camp was not only a site of imprisonment and forced labor, it was a testing ground where Nazi doctors and SS administrators experimented on human beings in the name of science, ideology, and efficiency. Here, medicine was stripped of its ethical core and repurposed as another instrument of domination, selection, and death. Sachsenhausen became one of the places where the Holocaust was medicalized, where suffering was measured, recorded, and repeated. From its earliest years, Sachsenhausen attracted SS physicians eager to prove their loyalty to the regime and advance their careers. These doctors were not fringe sadists acting alone. They were trained professionals who embraced Nazi racial theory and believed that prisoners, especially Jews, Roma, Soviet POWs, and the disabled, were expendable material. The camp's proximity to Berlin and its status as a model camp made it an ideal environment for experimentation. Results could be observed, refined, and reported directly to SS leadership. Medical examinations at Sachsenhausen were rarely intended to heal. Upon arrival, prisoners underwent selections masquerading as health checks. Those deemed too weak, sick, elderly, or unfit for labor were marked for removal. This did not mean treatment, it meant death. Some were sent to killing centers under Operation 14F-13, a program that extended the euthanasia killings into the concentration camp system. Others were murdered directly in the camp through lethal injections or starvation. One of the most notorious areas of abuse involved testing methods for mass killing and bodily endurance. Prisoners were subjected to experiments designed to test the limits of human survival. Starvation trials reduced daily rations to near zero while doctors observed physical decline. Victims were weighed, measured, and photographed as their bodies consumed themselves. Death was not a failure of the experiment, it was the endpoint. Infectious disease experiments were also common. Prisoners were deliberately infected with typhus, hepatitis, tuberculosis, and other illnesses. Treatments were withheld or altered to observe disease progression. Many died in agony, untreated, while doctors documented symptoms. Survivors were often permanently damaged, left blind, crippled, or mentally broken. These experiments contributed nothing of real scientific value, but they reinforced the Nazi belief that certain lives were disposable. Sachsenhausen also played a role in testing execution techniques. The camp became a proving ground for methods later used elsewhere. Prisoners were executed in ways designed to be efficient, quiet, and psychologically detached for the perpetrators. The infamous neckshot method, where victims were killed with a single bullet fired through a concealed opening, was refined here. The clinical nature of these killings reflected the fusion of medicine and murder. One particularly chilling experiment involved the testing of footwear for the German military. Prisoners were forced to march for hours or days on a specially constructed track, wearing prototype boots while carrying heavy loads. The goal was to test durability, but the cost was human flesh. Feet rotted, bones shattered, infections spread. Those who collapsed were beaten or executed. Doctors recorded data while bodies failed beneath them. Medical abuse extended into reproductive violence. Some prisoners were sterilized without consent. Others were castrated as punishment or experimentation. These acts were justified through racial ideology that framed certain groups as biologically dangerous. The destruction of future generations became part of the camp's mission. The SS doctors did not operate in isolation. Camp administration fully supported their work. Clerks recorded deaths as natural causes. Guards delivered victims on schedule. Supplies were allocated. This coordination revealed the true nature of the system. Murder was not an aberration. It was policy, supported by paperwork, hierarchy, and routine. What makes Sachsenhausen particularly significant is that many SS doctors trained here were later transferred to other camps, carrying their methods with them. The techniques refined at Sachsenhausen were exported to Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and beyond. The camp functioned as a classroom where cruelty was normalized and perfected. For prisoners, medical blocks were places of terror. Entering them often meant never returning. Rumors spread through barracks about selections, injections, and experiments. Fear of the doctor became as strong as fear of the guard. Healing was no longer associated with medicine, only death. Yet even here, resistance flickered. Some prisoner doctors and nurses secretly tried to save lives, falsifying records, hiding patients, or smuggling medicine. These acts were dangerous and rare, but they represented moral defiance within a system designed to erase ethics entirely. For every SS physician who abused power, there were imprisoned medical professionals who risked everything to preserve life. As the war dragged on, medical experiments intensified. Overcrowding and disease created endless research material. Death rates soared. The line between experiment and execution vanished completely. By the final years, Sachsenhausen had become a place where science no longer pretended to serve humanity. It served annihilation. This chapter reveals one of the most disturbing truths of the Holocaust. Genocide did not rely only on hatred or violence, but on educated men, institutional authority, and the corruption of knowledge itself. Sachsenhausen shows how easily medicine, when stripped of conscience, can become a tool of mass murder. In the next segment, we will examine how executions, extermination policies, and direct killing escalated at Sachsenhausen, transforming it from a place of controlled terror into a site of outright annihilation as the Nazi regime approached its collapse. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Mechanized Murder. Executions, extermination policies, and the normalization of death. By the time Sachsenhausen entered the middle years of the war, death was no longer an outcome of cruelty alone. It had become a scheduled function of the camp. Executions were systematized, refined, and hidden behind procedure. Killing was no longer chaotic or improvised. It was organized, recorded, and normalized. Sachsenhausen evolved into a place where murder was not only permitted, but expected, managed with the same bureaucratic precision as roll calls, labor assignments, and food distribution. Unlike extermination camps built solely for mass killing, Sachsenhausen operated as a hybrid, a concentration camp that gradually absorbed exterminatory functions. This made it particularly dangerous because death could arrive in many forms, through labor, starvation, medical abuse, punishment, or direct execution. The boundaries between these methods blurred until survival itself became accidental. Executions at Sachsenhausen were carried out both openly and in secret. Public hangings were staged as warnings. Prisoners were forced to watch as fellow inmates were executed for alleged sabotage, escape attempts, or resistance. These spectacles were not about justice, they were tools of psychological control. Fear was engineered deliberately, teaching prisoners that life could be taken at any moment, for any reason without explanation. More often, killing happened out of sight. The camp developed concealed execution facilities designed to minimize disturbance and emotional involvement. Victims were summoned under false pretenses, medical examinations, transfers, interrogations. They were led into rooms where death arrived instantly. The infamous neckshot execution, perfected at Sachsenhausen, allowed SS guards to kill silently and efficiently. Prisoners died without struggle, and their bodies were removed without witnesses. This method was later adopted across the camp system. Mass executions increased dramatically with the arrival of Soviet prisoners of war after 1941. Thousands were brought to Sachsenhausen and murdered shortly after arrival. These killings were carried out systematically, often within days, under orders that framed them as security measures. Soviet POWs were labeled dangerous, subhuman, and expendable. Their deaths were recorded impersonally, stripped of identity, reduced to numbers. Extermination policies also expanded through starvation. Food rations were deliberately reduced for specific prisoner groups. Jews, Soviet prisoners, and those marked as asocial or undesirable received less than others. Malnutrition weakened bodies, increased disease, and ensured high mortality without visible violence. Starvation was slow, deniable, and effective, perfect for a system that sought plausible distance from murder. Forced labor became another killing mechanism. Prisoners were assigned to exhausting tasks with no regard for physical condition. Quarries, workshops, armaments production, and construction projects consumed lives daily. Those who collapsed were beaten, denied medical care, or executed. Work itself became a sentence of death, carried out over weeks or months rather than minutes. As the war intensified, Sachsenhausen also became a node in broader extermination networks. Prisoners deemed no longer useful were transferred to killing centers or other camps with higher death rates. Paperwork disguised these movements as relocations or evacuations. In reality, they were death sentences issued with signatures and stamps. The camp administration treated these processes as routine. Meetings were held to discuss execution quotas. Transport schedules were coordinated. Clerks filed death reports listing causes such as heart failure or pneumonia, even when prisoners had been shot, hanged, or starved. Language became a weapon, sanitizing atrocity and protecting perpetrators from confronting their actions. Guards adapted quickly. Killing became ordinary. Many SS personnel rotated through execution duties, ensuring no one individual bore full responsibility. This diffusion of guilt was intentional. When everyone participated, no one felt solely accountable. Sachsenhausen trained its staff not just in violence, but in emotional detachment. Yet death did not only target the physically weak or politically dangerous. Arbitrary executions reminded prisoners that survival was never guaranteed. Minor infractions, stealing food, speaking out of turn, failing to meet quotas, could result in death. This unpredictability shattered any sense of safety or logic. Terror thrived in uncertainty. The psychological impact was immense. Prisoners lived surrounded by death, hearing shots at night, seeing bodies removed at dawn, watching empty bunks multiply. Hope became dangerous. Many stopped imagining the future entirely, focusing only on surviving the next hour, the next roll call, the next shift of labor. Despite this, resistance did not disappear. Some prisoners documented killings secretly. Others memorized names, dates, and methods determined to testify if they survived. Even under total domination, memory became a form of defiance. As the war turned against Germany, executions escalated rather than slowed. The SS sought to eliminate witnesses, suppress resistance, and maintain control as chaos spread. Sachsenhausen's role shifted from containment to eradication. Killing accelerated, driven by fear, ideology, and collapsing authority. This segment exposes a grim truth. Genocide does not require constant frenzy. It can operate quietly, efficiently, and routinely, carried out by people who treat death as paperwork. Sachsenhausen shows how murder became an administrative task, scheduled, documented, and normalized within an institution designed to destroy humanity while pretending to function normally. In the next segment, we will follow Sachsenhausen into its final phase, as evacuation orders, death marches, and collapse turned the camp into a moving catastrophe, spreading death far beyond its fences as the Nazi regime disintegrated. Chapter 6, Segment 3. The Camp Without Walls. Evacuations, death marches, and the spread of terror. As the Third Reich began to collapse under the pressure of advancing Allied armies, Sachsenhausen entered its final and most chaotic phase. The camp did not wind down. It unraveled violently. Orders from Berlin were no longer about discipline or efficiency. They were about erasure. The SS understood that the camp, once a model of controlled terror, had become a liability. It held witnesses, and witnesses in the Nazi worldview were dangerous. By late 1944 and early 1945, Sachsenhausen was overcrowded far beyond its capacity. Prisoners evacuated from camps in the east flooded in as the Red Army advanced. Barracks designed for hundreds now held thousands. Sanitation collapsed completely. Food supplies dwindled to near nothing. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis tore through the camp. Death was no longer hidden. It was visible everywhere, unavoidable, overwhelming. Yet even in this collapse, the SS did not abandon control. Instead, they shifted tactics. Camps were to be emptied before liberation. Prisoners were not to be freed. They were to be moved, exhausted, dispersed, or eliminated along the way. Thus began the death marches. In April 1945, tens of thousands of prisoners were forced out of Sachsenhausen and driven westward on foot. These marches were not evacuations in any humanitarian sense. They were moving death zones. Prisoners marched for days with almost no food or water, sleeping outdoors, exposed to cold and rain. Those who fell behind were beaten. Those who collapsed were shot. Bodies were left along roadsides, in ditches, in forests, unmarked and unnamed. The marches were deliberately brutal. They served multiple purposes: removing evidence, continuing punishment, and maintaining SS authority even as the state disintegrated. Guards no longer pretended these movements were temporary. Survival depended entirely on physical endurance, luck, and the mercy of individuals who often had none to give. Civilians along the routes witnessed scenes of horror: columns of skeletal figures guarded by armed men, shots ringing out when someone stumbled, bodies abandoned where they fell. Some locals tried to help, offering food or water in secret. Others turned away in fear. Many later testified that the death marches were the first undeniable proof of what the camps truly were. Inside Sachsenhausen itself, those left behind faced a different fate. The SS destroyed documents, dismantled execution facilities, and attempted to erase physical evidence of mass murder. Records were burned. Files vanished. The goal was not only to escape justice, but to rewrite history before it could be written at all. When Soviet forces finally reached Sachsenhausen in late April 1945, they did not find a functioning camp. They found a ruin filled with the dying. Thousands of prisoners were too weak to move. Many died even after liberation, their bodies unable to recover from years of starvation and abuse. Liberation arrived too late for them. The camp's transformation did not end with the war. Sachsenhausen was repurposed by Soviet authorities as a special camp, holding former Nazis, political opponents, and others deemed dangerous. Death continued, though under a different regime and for different reasons. The site remained a place of suffering, its legacy layered with multiple histories of repression. In the post-war years, the story of Sachsenhausen emerged slowly. Survivors testified at trials. Documents resurfaced. The camp's role as a training ground for the SS, a laboratory of terror, and a model for the entire concentration camp system became clear. What had once been hidden behind barbed wire was now exposed as a deliberate, engineered system of domination and destruction. Sachsenhausen's final months reveal a critical truth about Nazi terror. It did not collapse when defeat was certain. It intensified. Even as the regime crumbled, its commitment to violence remained intact. The death marches show that genocide does not require stability. It can continue amid chaos, driven by ideology rather than strategy. This segment closes the story of Sachsenhausen not with liberation alone, but with dispersion. Terror spilling outward, carried on roads, through villages, across borders. The camp did not simply end. It dissolved into Europe, leaving traces in mass graves, survivor memories, and unanswered questions. In the next chapter, we will confront the reckoning, the trials, testimonies, and moral aftermath that followed Sachsenhausen's collapse, and ask how a camp designed as a model forced the world to confront the systems that made mass murder possible. Chapter 7, Segment 1. The reckoning begins. Trials, testimony, and the struggle for truth. When the gates of Sachsenhausen finally stood open and the SS had fled, the world did not immediately understand what it was seeing. Liberation did not come with clarity. It came with shock, disbelief, and fragments of truth scattered among the living and the dead. For the survivors, freedom did not mean relief. It meant facing the impossible task of explaining what had happened in a place deliberately designed to leave no witnesses and no records. And for the outside world, Sachsenhausen posed a question that would define the post-war era. How does justice respond to a system that turned cruelty into routine? The first reckoning began almost immediately, but it was chaotic and incomplete. Allied investigators entered the camp and surrounding areas to document evidence before it vanished entirely. What they found was a landscape of partial destruction. Burned files, dismantled gallows, emptied execution rooms, and mass graves hastily covered or abandoned. Yet even in the SS' attempt to erase the past, the scale of the crime was unmistakable. Survivor testimony filled the gaps left by missing documents, providing names, routines, punishments, and chains of command that no fire could fully destroy. Sachsenhausen quickly became central to early war crimes investigations because of its unique role in the Nazi system. Unlike camps that existed primarily as sites of mass extermination, Sachsenhausen had been a command center, a training ground, and a testing laboratory for repression. Many of the SS officers who passed through its gates later held leadership roles across the camp network. This made Sachsenhausen not only a crime scene, but a blueprint, one whose architects could now be identified, questioned, and prosecuted. The Soviet authorities, who controlled the area after liberation, initiated their own investigations and trials. Some former SS personnel were arrested and interrogated, though these proceedings were shaped by the politics of the emerging Cold War. Justice was often swift, sometimes opaque, and not always transparent by later legal standards. While many perpetrators were punished, others disappeared into prisoner exchanges, bureaucratic reshuffling, or the fog of post-war chaos. In the Western zones, former Sachsenhausen officials would later appear as defendants in German courts during the 1950s and 1960s. These trials marked a different kind of reckoning, one carried out by a society forced to confront its own past. Prosecutors relied heavily on survivor testimony, which was often challenged, minimized, or dismissed by defense attorneys who argued that witnesses were unreliable due to trauma or time. Survivors were asked to relive their suffering under hostile questioning, forced to prove crimes that had been deliberately hidden. One of the greatest obstacles to justice was the bureaucratic nature of the camp itself. Many defendants claimed they were merely following orders, performing administrative tasks, or unaware of the full scope of the violence. The system that Sachsenhausen had perfected fragmented responsibility, euphemistic language, and hierarchical distance, now served as a shield against accountability. Murder had been divided into paperwork, transport orders, guard rotations, and medical inspections. Who, then, was guilty? Courts struggled with this question. Was guilt limited to those who pulled triggers and tightened nooses, or did it extend to those who designed the system, enforced discipline, or kept records running smoothly? Sachsenhausen forced the legal world to expand its understanding of criminal responsibility. For the first time, participation in an organized system of terror itself became evidence of guilt. At the same time, memory became a battlefield. In post-war Germany, Sachsenhausen's history was shaped by competing narratives. In East Germany, the camp was framed primarily as a site of anti-fascist resistance, emphasizing communist prisoners while downplaying others. Jewish suffering, Roma victims, and non-political detainees were often marginalized in official memorials. In the West, Sachsenhausen was less visible, overshadowed by Auschwitz and the extermination camps further east. Survivors fought against this erasure. They formed associations, recorded testimonies, and returned to the campsite to demand recognition. Their voices insisted that Sachsenhausen was not merely a prison for political enemies, but a central node in a system that targeted entire populations. They spoke of starvation, forced labor, executions, and the training of SS men who would carry these methods across Europe. The struggle for truth was slow and uneven. Many perpetrators lived quietly for decades, reintegrated into post-war society. Some held respectable jobs. Others died before facing trial. Justice, when it came, often felt partial and delayed. Yet each testimony, each document recovered, each verdict reached pushed back against the silence the Nazis had tried to impose. Sachsenhausen's reckoning revealed a deeper truth, that confronting mass atrocity is not a single event, but a process that unfolds across generations. Trials could punish individuals, but they could not undo the system. Memory had to carry what law could not. This segment marks the beginning of that long struggle, a shift from physical liberation to moral confrontation. In the next segment, we will explore how Sachsenhausen became a memorial site, how history was reconstructed from fragments, and how the camp's legacy continues to shape the way the world understands organized terror, obedience, and responsibility. Chapter 7, Segment 2. From Crime Scene to Memory Battleground. Sachsenhausen after 1945. When the war ended, Sachsenhausen did not immediately become a place of mourning or reflection. The ground where tens of thousands had suffered and died did not fall silent. Instead, it was absorbed into the shifting realities of post-war Europe. What followed was not a clean transition from terror to remembrance, but a complicated afterlife in which the camp's meaning was reshaped again and again by politics, ideology, and the unfinished business of history. And the months after liberation, Soviet authorities repurposed the former camp as Special Camp No. 7, later redesignated as Special Camp No. 1. Between 1945 and 1950, thousands of people, many accused of Nazi affiliation, others swept up through suspicion or denunciation, were imprisoned there without trial. Hunger, disease, and neglect returned to the barracks. Death did not stop. It merely changed uniforms. This second chapter of suffering complicated Sachsenhausen's story, layering one trauma atop another and making the site difficult to integrate into a single narrative of victimhood or justice. When the camp finally closed in 1950, the physical structures stood largely intact, but the meaning of the place remained contested. In the newly formed German Democratic Republic, Sachsenhausen was transformed into a national memorial. The state emphasized a specific story, one of communist resistance and anti-fascist heroism. Exhibitions highlighted political prisoners who had opposed Nazism, framing the camp as proof of the moral legitimacy of the socialist state. While this narrative preserved certain truths, It also excluded many others. Jewish victims, Roma and Sinti, homosexual prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so-called asocials were often marginalized or omitted entirely. Memory became selective. The camp that had trained SS officers to administer terror was now itself administered by a political system that shaped remembrance to fit its needs. Sachsenhausen was no longer a model camp for repression, but it was a model memorial for ideological storytelling. For survivors whose experiences did not fit the official narrative, recognition was partial at best. Some were welcomed, others were silenced. Across the divided Germany, the camp existed in different mental geographies. In the West, Sachsenhausen was distant, geographically and emotionally, overshadowed by Auschwitz and the extermination camps of Operation Reinhard. The story of how terror had been engineered, trained, and exported from a site near Berlin remained largely absent from public consciousness. The focus was on death factories, not on the systems that built them. It was only after German reunification that a fuller reckoning became possible. The collapse of the GDR opened archives, released suppressed testimonies, and forced a confrontation with the camp's layered history. Sachsenhausen could no longer be remembered as only a Nazi camp or only a Soviet camp. It had to be understood as both, a place where different regimes used imprisonment, deprivation, and silence to maintain control. Historians, educators, and survivor groups worked to reconstruct a more inclusive memory. Memorial exhibitions were redesigned to reflect the full spectrum of victims. The training role of the camp was emphasized again, restoring Sachsenhausen's place as a central node in the Nazi terror system. The language changed from heroic resistance to structural analysis, from ideology to human impact. Yet even this renewed effort faced challenges. How do you present a site that embodies multiple histories of repression without flattening them into equivalence? How do you honor all victims without erasing the specificity of their suffering? Sachsenhausen forced these questions into the open, becoming not just a memorial, but a classroom for the ethics of remembrance itself. Walking through the grounds today, visitors encounter absence as much as presence. Many buildings are gone. Others stand reconstructed, marked clearly as replicas. The emptiness is intentional. It resists spectacle. It asks visitors to imagine rather than consume. The roll call square, the execution trench, the industrial yards, each is framed not as a relic, but as evidence. Education at Sachsenhausen now centers on process rather than shock. The camp is presented as a system designed, staffed, regulated, and normalized. Visitors learn how categories were created, how punishment was routinized, how obedience was cultivated, and how cruelty became professionalized. This approach echoes the camp's original function, but in reverse. Where the SS once trained men to terrorize, the memorial now trains minds to recognize warning signs. The afterlife of Sachsenhausen reveals a final, unsettling truth. Sites of mass violence do not speak for themselves. They must be interpreted, protected, and challenged. Memory can be shaped by power just as easily as truth can be buried by it. The struggle over Sachsenhausen did not end in 1945. It merely changed form. In the next segment, we will turn from institutions to individuals, exploring how survivors carried Sachsenhausen with them for the rest of their lives, how trauma shaped testimony, and how personal memory became one of the most powerful tools against denial and forgetting. Chapter 7, Segment 3: Survivors, Silence, and the Long Struggle to Tell the Truth. For those who survived Sachsenhausen, liberation did not mean freedom from the camp. The barbed wire, the punishments, the hunger, the constant surveillance. These things did not remain behind the gates when the SS fled. They followed survivors into the rest of their lives, shaping their bodies, their memories, and their ability to speak about what had happened. Sachsenhausen was designed not only to destroy people physically, but to break them psychologically and its effects endured long after the uniforms changed and the watchtowers fell silent. Many survivors emerged from the camp malnourished, ill, and traumatized beyond what language could easily describe. Years of forced labor, beatings, executions witnessed at close range, and the daily humiliation of being reduced to a number left deep scars. Some could not sleep without reliving roll calls that lasted for hours. Others carried guilt for having survived when so many did not, especially those forced into administrative or labor roles that placed them closer to the machinery of the camp. Survival itself became a burden. In the immediate post-war years, speaking about Sachsenhausen was often met with indifference or disbelief. Europe was in ruins. Nations were rebuilding. Many people wanted to move forward, not backward. Survivors discovered that their stories made others uncomfortable, or were dismissed as exaggerations, or quietly ignored. In some cases, former SS guards reintegrated into civilian life more easily than former prisoners reintegrated into society. Political realities further complicated testimony. In East Germany, survivors whose experiences aligned with the official anti-fascist narrative, particularly communists, were encouraged to speak. Others were not. Jewish survivors, Roma survivors, and those persecuted for reasons outside political resistance often found their suffering minimized or excluded. Their memories did not fit the story the state wanted to tell. Silence, once enforced by terror, was now reinforced by ideology. In West Germany, a different silence prevailed. Legal accountability was limited, slow, and often reluctant. Many perpetrators avoided prosecution entirely, protected by statutes of limitation, lack of evidence, or the simple passage of time. Survivors who testified in trials were forced to relive their trauma in hostile courtrooms, facing defense attorneys who questioned their credibility and memory. Some never spoke publicly again. And yet, despite these barriers, survivors persisted. They wrote memoirs. They gave testimony to historians. They spoke in classrooms, community halls, and later memorial sites. Each act of remembrance was an act of resistance against the very system Sachsenhausen had been designed to perfect, the system of erasure. Where the camp had stripped people of identity, survivors insisted on names, faces, and stories. As decades passed, survivor testimony became one of the most critical pillars of historical understanding. Documents could show policies and orders. Architectural plans could show design. But only survivors could explain what it felt like to stand on the roll call square in freezing rain, to hear the sound of executions carried by the wind, to watch fellow prisoners collapse under impossible workloads. Their voices transformed statistics into human reality. Sachsenhausen's role as a training camp for the SS gave survivor testimony an additional weight. Survivors did not just describe suffering. They described how suffering was taught, rehearsed, and institutionalized. They spoke of guards who were new, uncertain, and later confident in cruelty. They noticed how punishment became more efficient, more methodical, more detached. These observations revealed the camp's true function, not chaos, but controlled terror. With reunification and renewed historical access, survivors were finally given broader platforms. Memorial programs actively sought their input. Oral history projects recorded testimonies before it was too late. Survivors walked the grounds with younger generations, pointing to places where buildings once stood, where people were killed, where choices were made. In these moments, memory overcame absence. Yet time has continued its work. Survivors are now few. Each year, more voices fall silent. Sachsenhausen has entered a new phase, one in which memory must be carried without those who lived it. This transition raises urgent questions. How do you preserve truth when living witnesses are gone? How do you prevent abstraction from dulling horror? How do you teach empathy without relying on first-hand pain? The answer lies partly in how Sachsenhausen is presented today. The camp is not framed as an anomaly, but as a process. Visitors are guided through the logic of classification, discipline, labor, and punishment. They learn how people were trained to obey orders, how cruelty was normalized through routine, how responsibility was diluted across departments and paperwork. The goal is not shock, it is understanding. Survivors understood this better than anyone. Many warned that the greatest danger was not forgetting specific events, but forgetting how easily systems can slide into inhumanity. Sachsenhausen was not built overnight. It evolved through planning, testing, and repetition. It was staffed by men who went home at night. It functioned through rules that appeared orderly on paper. Survivors insisted that remembering this was essential, not to dwell on the past, but to recognize warning signs in the present. Today, Sachsenhausen stands as both a memorial and a lesson. It tells the story of those who were imprisoned, tortured, and murdered, but it also tells the story of how terror can be engineered, taught, and replicated. Survivors gave this place its meaning. Without their voices, it would be only ruins and documents. With them, it remains a warning. In the next chapter, we will step back and examine Sachsenhausen's legacy beyond Germany, how its methods shaped the wider camp system, how its alumni carried terror across occupied Europe, and how a single model camp helped make genocide systematic. Chapter 8, Segment 1. From Model to Network, how Sachsenhausen shaped the entire Nazi camp system. Sachsenhausen was never meant to be an endpoint. From the moment it was conceived, it was designed as a beginning, a laboratory where the SS could experiment, refine, and standardize terror before exporting it across the expanding Reich. What emerged behind its gates was not improvisation or chaos, but a reproducible system. Sachsenhausen taught the Nazis how to run camps efficiently, how to break prisoners predictably, and how to transform ideology into daily routine. Its influence stretched far beyond its perimeter fence, shaping the structure and function of nearly every major concentration and extermination camp that followed. The camp's physical layout alone became a template. Sachsenhausen's triangular design was engineered for maximum visibility and control. From a central watchtower, guards could observe the barracks, roll call square, and internal roads in a single glance. This architectural logic, visibility as dominance, was later replicated in camps such as Buchenwald, Mauthausen, and Auschwitz. It allowed fewer guards to control larger populations and reinforced the psychological reality that prisoners were always being watched, even when no guard was visible. But architecture was only the beginning. Sachsenhausen refined administrative systems that would become standard across the Nazi camp universe. Prisoners were classified by colored triangles, numbers replaced names, and personal histories were reduced to categories that determined rations, labor assignments, punishments, and likelihood of survival. This bureaucratic sorting stripped people of individuality while allowing guards to claim they were merely enforcing classifications, not making moral decisions. Responsibility dissolved into paperwork. Training was Sachsenhausen's most significant export. SS guards rotated through the camp as part of their professional development. Here, they learned how to conduct roll calls that lasted hours, how to administer beatings according to regulation, how to impose collective punishment, and how to execute prisoners with procedural efficiency. Violence was framed as duty. Cruelty was normalized through repetition. Guards were evaluated not on empathy or restraint, but on discipline and obedience. These men did not remain at Sachsenhausen. They were transferred to new camps as the Nazi camp system expanded eastward. They carried with them not only techniques but attitudes, how to view prisoners as units, how to detach emotionally, how to follow orders without questioning outcomes. In this way, Sachsenhausen became a school whose graduates staffed the machinery of genocide elsewhere. Forced labor systems tested at Sachsenhausen were also exported. The camp functioned as a reservoir of expendable labor, feeding prisoners into SS-run industries, armaments factories, and infrastructure projects. Labor was not organized for long-term productivity but for extraction until collapse. This principle, work as a tool of destruction, was later implemented on an even larger scale in camps like Auschwitz-Monowitz and Gross-Rosen. Sachsenhausen proved that forced labor could serve both economic and exterminatory goals simultaneously. Punishment methods developed at Sachsenhausen likewise spread across the system. Devices such as the punishment post, prolonged standing cells, starvation rations, and arbitrary beatings were not spontaneous acts of sadism. They were regulated, documented, and taught. The camp demonstrated how to maintain an atmosphere of constant fear without requiring constant violence. Uncertainty itself became a weapon. Sachsenhausen also played a crucial role in the evolution of mass killing practices. While it was not primarily an extermination camp, executions were frequent and methodical. Prisoners were shot at specially constructed facilities, hanged publicly as warnings, or killed under the guise of medical procedures. These killings were bureaucratized, recorded, justified, and concealed through euphemistic language. This administrative approach to death laid groundwork for later extermination camps, where killing would be scaled up but managed with similar detachment. The camp's proximity to Berlin gave it particular importance. Senior SS officials visited regularly. Inspections were conducted not to reduce suffering, but to optimize control. Sachsenhausen became a showcase, proof that terror could be organized, disciplined, and made routine. What worked here was assumed to work elsewhere. As the Holocaust intensified, the logic perfected at Sachsenhausen merged with new technologies and ambitions. Camps designed solely for killing Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka did not emerge in isolation. They were built by men who had learned the fundamentals of control, deception, and dehumanization in places like Sachsenhausen. The transition from concentration camp to extermination camp was not a moral leap. It was a technical one. Even language developed at Sachsenhausen spread. Euphemisms such as special treatment, protective custody, and resettlement masked violence behind administrative neutrality. This language allowed perpetrators to distance themselves psychologically from their actions while enabling mass participation across ministries, railways, and industries. Sachsenhausen demonstrated that genocide did not require constant hatred, only sustained compliance. What made Sachsenhausen especially dangerous was its success. It proved that terror could be systematized without collapsing into disorder. It showed that prisoners could be controlled through rules as much as through brutality. It trained personnel who would later implement mass murder on unprecedented scales. In this sense, Sachsenhausen was not merely a camp, it was an operating system. Understanding this legacy is essential. The Holocaust did not unfold as a sudden explosion of violence. It expanded through models that worked. Sachsenhausen was one of the most important of those models. It turned ideology into procedure, hatred into routine, and murder into administration. In the next segment, we will follow the path of Sachsenhausen's methods into the extermination phase of the Holocaust, examining how lessons learned here were adapted for camps designed solely for death, and how a model camp helped make genocide industrial. Chapter 8, Segment 2. From Discipline to Death. How Sachsenhausen's methods evolved into extermination. By the early 1940s, the Nazi concentration camp system had crossed a point of no return. What had begun as a mechanism for repression and control was transforming into a system of annihilation. Sachsenhausen stood at the center of this transition. The camp did not merely reflect the radicalization of Nazi policy, it actively shaped it. The routines, structures, and mental frameworks developed there provided the foundation upon which extermination could be expanded, scaled, and rationalized. The shift from imprisonment to destruction did not require reinvention. It required only escalation. At Sachsenhausen, the SS learned that death did not need chaos to be effective. It could be slow, orderly, and bureaucratic. Prisoners were not always killed immediately. Instead, they were consumed through starvation rations calculated to weaken but not immediately kill, through labor quotas designed to exceed human limits, and through medical neglect that allowed disease to spread unchecked. This gradual destruction served two purposes. It extracted maximum labor value and reduced resistance by exhaustion. When death finally came, it appeared almost inevitable, the result of natural causes within the camp's internal logic. This principle, extermination through process rather than spectacle, became essential to the later death camps. Sachsenhausen demonstrated that mass death could be disguised as administration. Guards could claim they were enforcing work schedules. Doctors could claim they were following regulations. Clerks could claim they were processing transfers. No single individual needed to acknowledge the full outcome. Responsibility was fragmented until it vanished. Medical experimentation at Sachsenhausen played a particularly dark role in this evolution. Prisoners were subjected to experiments involving poisons, infectious diseases, forced sterilization, and execution methods. These experiments were not only acts of cruelty. They were tests. The SS evaluated efficiency, concealment, and repeatability. One of the most infamous examples was the development of execution techniques disguised as medical procedures, methods that would later influence killing practices elsewhere. Death was reframed as a technical problem to be solved. Sachsenhausen also refined the psychology of obedience. Guards were trained to see prisoners not as enemies or even victims, but as material. This dehumanization was reinforced through language, uniforms, numbers, and constant punishment. Over time, violence became procedural rather than emotional. Guards no longer needed rage to kill. They needed only compliance. This emotional detachment would become crucial when killing scaled from hundreds to thousands per day. The camp's administrative records reveal another key transformation: normalization. Deaths were logged, categorized, and reported with chilling regularity. Executions were scheduled. Bodies were processed. Cremation became routine. This regularity dulled moral awareness and replaced it with clerical habit. Sachsenhausen showed that once killing was integrated into daily workflow, it ceased to feel extraordinary. As the Nazi leadership moved toward the final solution, they relied on this accumulated knowledge. When extermination camps were constructed in occupied Poland, they did not emerge from ignorance. They were staffed by men who already understood how to manage prisoners, suppress resistance, conceal crimes, and justify actions internally. Sachsenhausen had taught them how to operate without conscience. Even deception, one of the Holocaust's most insidious tools, was refined here. Prisoners were frequently misled about their fate, told they were being transferred, punished temporarily, or reassigned. This manipulation reduced panic and resistance, making control easier. Later, at camps like Treblinka and Sobibor, deception would become central to mass murder itself. The psychological groundwork had been laid. Sachsenhausen's role as a hub also meant that information flowed outward. Reports, recommendations, and personnel transfers carried lessons learned from failures and successes. If a punishment provoked unrest, it was modified. If a labor system reduced productivity too quickly, rations were adjusted. The system was calibrated continuously, not to preserve life, but to optimize domination. By the time gas chambers became the primary killing method elsewhere, the moral groundwork had already been completed. The SS no longer needed to convince itself that killing was necessary. Sachsenhausen had already proven that humans could be reduced to expendable units through structure alone. The extermination camps simply accelerated what had already been normalized. It is essential to understand that Sachsenhausen did not exist in parallel to the Holocaust. It was part of its developmental spine. The camp trained the minds that would later oversee industrialized murder. It proved that terror could be taught, replicated, and improved. In doing so, it erased the illusion that genocide required monstrous individuals. It showed instead that systems could manufacture monsters through routine. In the next segment, we will examine the prisoners themselves, not as statistics, but as human beings navigating this engineered nightmare. We will explore how different groups were targeted, how survival strategies emerged, and how resistance, both quiet and overt, persisted even within a system designed to extinguish it. Chapter 8, Segment 3. The Prisoners: Survival, Resistance, and Humanity Inside the Model Camp. Behind the systems, regulations, and calculations that defined Sachsenhausen were human beings forced to live inside a structure designed to erase them. The camp held political opponents, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, so-called asocials, common criminals, and later tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war. Each category was marked by a colored triangle sewn onto striped uniforms, a visual code that reduced identity to classification. This system was not accidental. By dividing prisoners into categories, the SS encouraged distrust, hierarchy, and fragmentation, weakening solidarity and making collective resistance more difficult. Yet even within this engineered isolation, humanity endured. Daily life inside Sachsenhausen was a constant negotiation with death. Prisoners woke before dawn to roll calls that could last for hours in freezing temperatures or brutal heat. Men collapsed and died standing, their bodies held upright by those beside them to avoid punishment. Food consisted of thin soup and scraps of bread, carefully calibrated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to work. Hunger dominated every thought. It shaped behavior, fractured friendships, and forced impossible moral choices. A crust of bread could mean survival or betrayal. Forced labor consumed the days. Prisoners worked in quarries, brickworks, armaments factories, and SS-owned enterprises designed to profit from exhaustion. The infamous shoe-testing track symbolized Sachsenhausen's cruelty. Prisoners were forced to march for hours each day on different surfaces, carrying heavy loads, until their feet bled and bones shattered. The work had no purpose beyond punishment and endurance testing. Survival depended not on strength alone, but on luck, connections, and the ability to avoid notice. Disease spread relentlessly. Overcrowding, lice, and malnutrition turned typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis into death sentences. Medical care was not meant to heal. Camp doctors selected prisoners for experiments or declared the weak unfit, sending them to execution sites or killing facilities. Infirmaries became waiting rooms for death. To be admitted was often to disappear. Yet even here, resistance existed. It did not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it was survival itself. Prisoners shared knowledge about guards, work details, and schedules. They stole moments of rest. They exchanged information through whispers, gestures, and coded language. Skilled prisoners, doctors, clerks, craftsmen, sometimes used their positions to protect others, falsifying records, hiding the sick, or delaying transfers. These acts carried enormous risk. Discovery meant torture or death, not just for the individual but often for others. Political prisoners formed some of the earliest resistance networks. Communists, social democrats, and anti-Nazi activists had organizational experience and used it to create underground structures within the camp. They distributed food secretly, passed news from the outside world, and maintained morale. Cultural resistance also emerged. Prisoners recited poetry, sang forbidden songs, and held clandestine lectures. These acts preserved identity in a place designed to strip it away. For Jewish prisoners, survival was even more precarious. They were subjected to harsher treatment, frequent selections, and near-total isolation. Despite this, acts of solidarity persisted. Sharing food, caring for the sick, and preserving religious traditions in secret. Faith, for some, became a form of defiance. For others, it was memory itself, the refusal to forget who they had been. Soviet prisoners of war faced annihilation on arrival. Tens of thousands were executed shortly after entering Sachsenhausen, often shot in specially designed facilities disguised as medical examination rooms. Those who survived initial selections endured starvation and brutality unmatched even within the camp. Their deaths revealed how Sachsenhausen functioned as a testing ground for mass execution techniques later expanded elsewhere. The presence of criminal prisoners, often given privileged positions by the SS, added another layer of complexity. Some abused their power, enforcing SS discipline to secure their own survival. Others quietly assisted resistance efforts. The camp's social structure was not simply victim versus oppressor. It was a distorted hierarchy engineered to force prisoners into impossible roles. Occasionally, resistance crossed into open defiance. Sabotage occurred in workshops. Information was smuggled to the outside world. As the war neared its end, underground groups prepared for potential uprisings, though the camp's proximity to Berlin and heavy SS presence made large-scale revolt nearly impossible. Survival, not revolution, remained the priority. What defined Sachsenhausen was not only cruelty, but the deliberate attempt to make prisoners complicit in their own destruction by forcing choices between self-preservation and solidarity. The system sought to break moral frameworks, replacing them with instinct alone. That it did not fully succeed is one of the camp's most important truths. Survivor testimonies speak not only of suffering, but of moments of kindness that defied the system's logic. A shared spoonful of soup, a warning whispered in time, a hand steadying another during roll call. These moments did not dismantle the camp, but they preserved something essential, the idea that humanity could survive even where it was most violently denied. In the next chapter, we will follow Sachsenhausen into its final phase. The collapse of the Nazi regime, the evacuation marches, the liberation of the camp, and the transformation of a place of terror into a site of memory. What happened after the gates opened would shape not only justice, but how the world would remember what Sachsenhausen had been designed to teach. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Evacuation, Death Marches, and the Collapse of the Model Camp. By early 1945, the structure that had defined Sachsenhausen for nearly a decade began to fracture under the weight of a collapsing Reich. The camp, once meticulously organized and presented as the SS model of control, now existed in a state of controlled chaos. Allied bombers passed overhead. Front lines closed in from east and west. Berlin, only a short distance away, trembled under constant assault. Yet inside Sachsenhausen, the machinery of terror did not stop. It accelerated, transforming the camp's final months into one of its deadliest phases. As the Red Army advanced from the east, orders arrived from SS leadership that would seal the fate of tens of thousands of prisoners. Camps were not to be liberated. Prisoners were not to be rescued. Witnesses were to be removed. Sachsenhausen's role as a training and administrative center now shifted toward erasure. Records were destroyed. Evidence was burned. And prisoners, weak, starving, diseased, were prepared for evacuation under the guise of relocation. Evacuation did not mean survival. It meant death on the road. Beginning in late January and accelerating through March and April, columns of prisoners were forced out of Sachsenhausen and its satellite camps. They were given little food, no adequate clothing, and no clear destination. Guards marched them through snow-covered roads, forests, and villages, often for days at a time. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who could not rise were shot where they fell. The SS referred to these movements as transfers. Survivors would remember them as death marches. The condition of the prisoners made survival almost impossible. Years of forced labor, starvation, and disease had reduced many to skeletal forms. Feet wrapped in rags bled through frozen ground. Typhus spread rapidly among the marching columns. Prisoners leaned on one another to remain upright, knowing that falling meant death. Civilians along the routes sometimes watched in silence. Others secretly left food on roadsides, risking punishment themselves. Small acts of humanity flickered against the enormity of the crime. Inside the camp, conditions deteriorated just as rapidly. Overcrowding intensified as prisoners evacuated from other camps were pushed into Sachsenhausen. Food rations collapsed entirely. Roll calls continued even as bombs fell nearby. The SS maintained discipline through terror, but their authority was visibly unraveling. Guards fled their posts. Orders contradicted one another. Panic seeped through the ranks of those who had once ruled without question. Executions continued until the very end. Political prisoners suspected of resistance, Soviet POWs, and those deemed too weak to march were murdered inside the campgrounds. The killing facilities, once used with clinical efficiency, now operated amid confusion and desperation. Sachsenhausen, the camp designed to teach order, descended into disorder, but never into mercy. As April approached, the SS faced an impossible dilemma.
Berlin was falling.
Escape routes narrowed. Some guards abandoned their uniforms and disappeared into civilian crowds. Others clung to ideology, enforcing rules even as the system collapsed around them. For prisoners, rumors spread faster than facts. Liberation seemed close, yet death remained immediate. On April 21, 1945, the final evacuation order was given. Tens of thousands were driven out in multiple columns toward the northwest. What followed was one of the largest death marches of the war. Corpses lined the roads. Mass graves were hastily dug. Survivors would later struggle to describe the scale of loss, not because memory failed them, but because language itself seemed inadequate. 2 days later, Soviet troops entered Sachsenhausen. They found a camp nearly emptied of life, yet overflowing with death. Thousands of prisoners too sick to march lay abandoned in barracks. Bodies remained unburied. The infrastructure of terror still stood: guard towers, fences, execution sites, silent witnesses to what had been engineered there. Liberation did not mean immediate relief. Disease ravaged the survivors. Medical teams struggled to contain typhus outbreaks. Many died days or weeks after freedom arrived, their bodies unable to recover from years of abuse. The model camp had trained the SS how to rule through fear, and even in its final moments it continued to kill. In the wake of liberation, Sachsenhausen became something else entirely. It became evidence. Investigators documented what remained. Survivors gave testimony. Photographs captured the architecture of terror that the Nazis had once proudly displayed. The camp that taught the system how to function would now help expose it. But the story was far from over. In the next segment, we will examine what happened after the war, how justice was pursued, how memory was shaped, and how Sachsenhausen's legacy would echo far beyond its barbed wire, forcing the world to confront what a model of terror truly meant. Chapter 9, Segment 2. Liberation, Survival, and the Struggle to Document the Truth. When Soviet forces reached Sachsenhausen in late April 1945, they did not find a triumphant ending to a long nightmare. They found a place emptied of most of its prisoners, yet saturated with death, disease, and silence. The camp that had once housed more than 60,000 people now contained only a fraction of that number. Those too sick, too weak, or too close to death to be marched away. Liberation arrived not as celebration, but as shock. For many survivors, it arrived too late. Inside the remaining barracks, Soviet soldiers encountered men barely recognizable as human. Starvation had stripped bodies down to bone. Typhus raged unchecked. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and untreated wounds filled the air with the smell of decay. Many prisoners lay delirious, unable to understand that the SS were gone. Some were afraid to move, conditioned by years of punishment for the smallest act of defiance. Freedom, when it came, was confusing, fragile, and uncertain. Medical aid began immediately, but the scale of suffering overwhelmed even experienced military doctors. Thousands required urgent treatment. Improvised hospitals were set up inside and around the camp. Soviet medical units struggled to contain the typhus epidemic, isolating the sick and burning contaminated clothing and bedding. Despite these efforts, many survivors died in the days and weeks following liberation, their bodies unable to recover from prolonged starvation and abuse. For them, liberation was not salvation, but a final moment of recognition. At the same time, the work of documentation began. Soviet investigators understood that Sachsenhausen was not merely a prison, but a crime scene of extraordinary scale. They photographed barracks, execution sites, punishment cells, and mass graves. They collected SS records that had not been destroyed in time. Survivors were interviewed as soon as they were physically able to speak. Their testimonies, often halting and fragmented, described a system of terror that had been refined with precision and enforced without mercy. What emerged from these early investigations was a chilling realization. Sachsenhausen was not an aberration. It was a template. The camp's design, its administrative hierarchy, its punishment methods, and its labor exploitation system had been exported across the Nazi concentration camp network. The crimes committed here were not spontaneous acts of cruelty, but the result of training, policy, and deliberate planning. This understanding would shape how post-war justice approached the question of responsibility. Yet justice did not come quickly, nor evenly. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the priority was stabilization, feeding survivors, preventing disease, and restoring a basic sense of order. Many former prisoners were displaced persons with no homes to return to, no families left alive, and no countries willing or able to receive them. Some remained near the camp for months, waiting for clarity about their future. Others set out across a devastated Europe, carrying trauma that had no language yet. Meanwhile, the SS personnel who had operated Sachsenhausen followed divergent paths. Some were captured quickly. Others disappeared into the chaos of defeat, shedding uniforms and identities. A number would later be arrested and brought to trial. For survivors, these trials carried immense symbolic weight. Sachsenhausen had been a place where law was replaced by absolute power. The courtroom represented a fragile attempt to restore moral order, to assert that crimes committed under the banner of obedience were still crimes. Testimony during post-war proceedings revealed the depth of institutional involvement. Guards spoke of following orders. Administrators described their roles as technical or bureaucratic. Doctors defended experiments as medical necessity. The same language that had sanitized murder during the war was now used to distance individuals from responsibility. Yet survivor accounts cut through these defenses, describing daily life inside the camp in vivid detail. Roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing weather, punishments designed to break the body, executions carried out with routine efficiency. Sachsenhausen's role as a training center for the SS made these revelations particularly damning. This was not merely a site of suffering. It was a school of terror. Men learned here how to dominate, how to punish, how to kill, and then carried those lessons across occupied Europe. The camp's legacy, therefore, extended far beyond its fences. It lived on in the countless places shaped by its example. As years passed, memory itself became a battleground. In the divided post-war world, Sachsenhausen fell within the Soviet zone and later the German Democratic Republic. The site was repurposed, reinterpreted, and sometimes politicized. Certain victim groups were emphasized, others marginalized. Yet despite these distortions, the core truth remained embedded in the ground. This had been a place where systematic cruelty was perfected. For survivors, remembering was both a duty and a burden. Many spoke publicly so that the world would know what had happened. Others remained silent, unable to revisit experiences that had nearly destroyed them. Their lives after the camp were shaped by loss, by memory, and by the knowledge that the system which harmed them had been built by ordinary structures, offices, uniforms, regulations that could exist anywhere. In the next segment, we will examine how Sachsenhausen's story was preserved, contested, and ultimately integrated into the broader understanding of the Holocaust, how a camp designed to teach terror became a permanent warning, and why its lessons remain urgently relevant long after the barbed wire stopped humming with electricity. Chapter 9, Segment 3. Memory, Responsibility, and the Camp That Taught Terror. As the immediate aftermath of liberation faded and the world began the long process of rebuilding, Sachsenhausen entered a new and complicated phase of existence, one shaped not by barbed wire and SS commands, but by memory, politics, and the unresolved question of responsibility. Unlike many camps that were reduced to rubble or absorbed into growing cities, Sachsenhausen remained physically present. Its buildings stood. Its parade ground lay exposed. Its execution sites remained etched into the landscape. The camp could not be easily erased, and that permanence forced societies to confront what had happened there. In the early post-war years, Sachsenhausen was transformed once again, this time into a site of detention under Soviet control. Former Nazis, suspected collaborators, and political prisoners were held there in what became known as Special Camp No. 7. This continuity of imprisonment complicated the camp's legacy. For survivors of Nazi persecution, the reuse of the site reopened wounds. For historians, it blurred public understanding of Sachsenhausen's primary function during the Third Reich. The ground absorbed new suffering, layered atop the old, creating a difficult moral terrain where victimhood and responsibility were often entangled in political narratives. As East Germany solidified its identity, Sachsenhausen became a state memorial. The official story emphasized anti-fascist resistance and political prisoners, aligning with the ideological priorities of the regime. Communist victims were highlighted, while Jewish suffering, Roma persecution, and the experiences of other targeted groups received less attention. The camp's role as a training center for the SS, a central element of its historical significance, was acknowledged but often subordinated to broader narratives of heroic resistance and socialist triumph over fascism. Yet memory has a way of resisting containment. Survivors continued to speak, write, and testify beyond official frameworks. International researchers returned to the site. Archives opened gradually. Documents long ignored or suppressed resurfaced. Over time, a fuller picture of Sachsenhausen emerged, one that recognized its function not only as a prison, but as a laboratory of terror, where methods of domination were refined and then exported across the Nazi camp system. This recognition forced a deeper reckoning. Sachsenhausen was not merely a place where crimes occurred. It was a place where crimes were taught. Guards were trained to dehumanize. Administrators learned how to manage human beings as expendable resources. Doctors practiced medicine stripped of ethics. Bureaucrats perfected paperwork that turned lives into numbers and deaths into statistics. The camp embodied a system in which cruelty was normalized through repetition, hierarchy, and obedience. The question that haunted post-war generations was not only how such a place could exist, but how so many people participated in its operation without resistance. The answer lay partly in the camp's design. Sachsenhausen functioned through division between prisoner groups, between guards and administrators, between responsibility and action. Each individual performed a limited role, often shielded from the full consequences of the system. This fragmentation made moral disengagement possible. It allowed people to believe they were simply doing a job. Trials and historical investigations slowly dismantled these illusions. Evidence showed that knowledge of abuse was widespread. Participation was voluntary far more often than claimed. Choices existed, even within a dictatorship, though they carried risks. Sachsenhausen thus became a case study in complicity, not only of fanatics but of professionals, clerks, engineers, and doctors who adapted themselves to a system of terror. In the decades following German reunification, Sachsenhausen underwent a profound transformation. The memorial was restructured to reflect a more comprehensive historical narrative. Jewish victims were restored to the center of the story. The camp's role in the Holocaust was explicitly addressed. Educational programs expanded, emphasizing not only what happened, but how and why it happened. Sachsenhausen became a place of learning rather than ideology, a site that demanded reflection rather than slogans. Visitors today walk through reconstructed barracks, execution sites, and administrative buildings. They see the geometry of control, the open parade ground designed for surveillance, the triangular layout optimized for domination, the proximity of offices to punishment areas. Nothing about Sachsenhausen feels accidental. Every structure reveals intention. Every path speaks of order imposed upon suffering. What makes Sachsenhausen especially disturbing is its ordinariness. There were no elaborate disguises here, no remote wilderness separating crime from society. The camp stood near Berlin, visible, accessible, integrated into the machinery of the state. It trained men who would go on to operate camps across Europe. In this sense, Sachsenhausen was not an exception, it was the rule being written. Its legacy, therefore, extends beyond history. Sachsenhausen forces uncomfortable questions about modern institutions, obedience, and moral responsibility. It shows how systems can transform cruelty into routine and how language can mask violence behind neutrality. It reminds us that genocide does not begin with murder. It begins with classification, discipline, and the erosion of empathy. For survivors and descendants, Sachsenhausen remains a place of mourning. For historians, it is a critical key to understanding how the Holocaust functioned as a system. For the world, it stands as a warning. The camp taught terror, but it also teaches memory, if we are willing to listen. In the final chapter, we will draw these lessons together, examining what Sachsenhausen ultimately reveals about power, obedience, and the fragile boundaries between civilization and collapse, and why remembering this camp is not only an act of remembrance, but an act of responsibility for the future. Chapter 10. Segment 1: What Sachsenhausen Taught the World. Sachsenhausen was never intended to be hidden. Unlike extermination camps built deep in occupied territories, this camp stood close to the heart of Nazi Germany, only a short distance from Berlin. Its visibility was not a flaw, it was a feature. Sachsenhausen was designed to demonstrate how terror could be organized, managed, and normalized within a modern state. In that sense, it represents one of the clearest windows into how the Holocaust became possible, not as chaos but as policy. From its earliest days, Sachsenhausen functioned as a proving ground. This triangular layout allowed total surveillance. Its parade ground enforced ritualized humiliation. Its punishment systems were standardized, recorded, refined. Every aspect of daily life was measured, regulated, and weaponized. The camp taught SS guards how to break prisoners psychologically before breaking them physically. It taught administrators how to balance labor output against death rates. It taught doctors how to strip medicine of compassion and turn it into a tool of experimentation and control. Nothing was improvised. Everything was repeatable. This was the camp's most dangerous lesson, that mass cruelty could be systematized, that violence did not need rage. It needed organization. At Sachsenhausen, terror was not emotional, it was procedural. Guards were trained not to hate loudly, but to obey quietly. Orders passed through paperwork, schedules, and protocols. Suffering was documented with the same precision as inventory. This bureaucratic calm allowed participants to distance themselves from the consequences of their actions, creating a psychological buffer between responsibility and outcome. The men trained at Sachsenhausen carried these lessons outward. They staffed camps across the Reich. They oversaw ghettos, labor sites, and later extermination centers. Sachsenhausen became a template not only for physical infrastructure, but for mindset. The camp demonstrated that an institution could produce cruelty continuously without requiring constant ideological fervor. Once the system was built, it sustained itself. This understanding challenges comforting myths about the Holocaust. It was not committed solely by sadists or fanatics. It was carried out by clerks, engineers, doctors, accountants, and supervisors, many of whom had once lived ordinary lives. Sachsenhausen reveals how professionalism can become dangerous when ethics are removed from authority. It shows how obedience, when separated from moral judgment, becomes a weapon. The camp also exposes the fragility of resistance in such environments. Prisoners resisted when they could, through sabotage, mutual aid, memory, and testimony. But the system was designed to isolate, divide, and exhaust. Categories of prisoners were deliberately pitted against one another. Privileges were used to create dependency. Fear was sustained through unpredictability. Sachsenhausen did not rely on constant violence alone. It relied on anticipation, surveillance, and the erosion of trust. When liberation came, it did not bring immediate clarity. The camp stood as evidence, but understanding lagged behind horror. Early photographs captured bodies and buildings, but not systems. It would take decades of research to fully grasp Sachsenhausen's role as an institutional training center for genocide. Only later did historians recognize that the camp's greatest crime was not only what happened there, but what it taught elsewhere. In post-war Germany, this realization forced a reckoning that unfolded slowly and unevenly. Trials punished some perpetrators, but many reintegrated into society. Administrative continuity softened accountability. For years, the focus remained on individual guilt rather than systemic failure. Sachsenhausen, however, resists such simplification. Its history demands attention to structures, incentives, and routines, the invisible frameworks that made mass murder sustainable. Today, Sachsenhausen stands as both memorial and warning. It demonstrates that modernity does not prevent atrocity, it can enable it. The same tools that organize healthcare, transportation, and industry can be redirected toward destruction when guided by ideology and stripped of ethics. The camp reminds us that genocide is not an ancient phenomenon. It is a modern one, born from efficiency, obedience, and dehumanization. The lesson of Sachsenhausen is therefore not confined to the past. It speaks to any society that values order without accountability, discipline without conscience, or loyalty without limits. It warns that institutions reflect the values embedded within them, and that when those values shift, systems can become lethal with terrifying speed. As we move toward the conclusion of this documentary, Sachsenhausen demands one final act from us. Not horror, not shock, but vigilance. Remembering this camp is not about memorizing facts alone. It is about recognizing patterns. It is about understanding how ordinary systems can be corrupted, how responsibility can be diluted, and how silence can become collaboration. In the final segment, we will confront the enduring responsibility left behind by Sachsenhausen, what it asks of memory, education, and moral courage in a world where the conditions that enabled it have not disappeared, only changed form. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Memory, Justice, and the Failure of Closure. After the gates of Sachsenhausen were opened and the SS fled, the world faced a problem it had never encountered on this scale before. How to respond to a crime that was not an aberration, but a system. Liberation revealed the physical remnants of terror, barracks, execution sites, mass graves, but it did not automatically produce justice, nor did it guarantee understanding. What followed was not a clean transition from atrocity to accountability, but a long, fractured struggle over responsibility, memory, and truth. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the priority was survival. Thousands of former prisoners were barely alive, suffering from starvation, disease, and trauma that could not be treated with food or medicine alone. Typhus outbreaks threatened both survivors and liberators. Medical teams worked under extreme pressure, often discovering that well-intentioned aid could kill those whose bodies could no longer process normal nutrition. Liberation, for many, was not a moment of joy, but of fragile uncertainty. Justice came slowly and incompletely. While some Sachsenhausen personnel were tried by Soviet military tribunals, many SS guards, administrators, and medical staff disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. Others were absorbed back into civilian life, protected by bureaucracy, amnesty laws, or simple anonymity. The camp itself had produced not only cruelty, but plausible deniability. Paperwork obscured intent. Orders flowed downward. Responsibility dissolved into hierarchy. This failure to fully prosecute perpetrators was not simply a moral shortcoming, it was a structural one. Legal systems struggled to categorize crimes that had been legal under Nazi law. Defense arguments relied on obedience, precedent, and technical compliance. The very bureaucratic logic that enabled Sachsenhausen to function now shielded many of those who had operated it. Justice demanded moral clarity, but courts were bound by legal frameworks that had not anticipated genocide as a routine administrative process. Memory, too, was contested. In East Germany, Sachsenhausen was preserved as an anti-fascist memorial, but the narrative emphasized communist resistance while marginalizing Jewish suffering and other victim groups. In West Germany, the camp existed largely in silence for years, overshadowed by political reconstruction and economic recovery. Across both systems, memory was shaped by ideology, not always by completeness. Survivors carried the burden of testimony. Many spoke immediately, desperate to ensure that what they had witnessed would not be denied. Others remained silent for decades, unable or unwilling to relive trauma in a world that often preferred forgetting. Their accounts were sometimes doubted, sometimes ignored, sometimes reduced to footnotes. Yet without them, Sachsenhausen would have remained a place of buildings without voices. As historical research expanded in the late 20th century, Sachsenhausen's role as a model camp became clearer. Scholars traced the transfer of personnel, practices, and procedures from this site to others across the Nazi camp network. This research dismantled the myth that the Holocaust escalated spontaneously. It revealed a learning process, one in which Sachsenhausen functioned as a laboratory of repression. This realization reshaped how historians understood responsibility. The question was no longer only who committed crimes, but who designed systems that made crimes inevitable. Accountability extended beyond guards with weapons to planners with clipboards, doctors with charts, and officials with timetables. Sachsenhausen forced a redefinition of guilt that included those who never struck a blow, but made violence efficient. Today, the memorial stands not only as a record of suffering, but as a challenge. It asks visitors to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily modern institutions can be repurposed for harm. It resists narratives that frame the Holocaust as the product of madness or inevitability. Instead, it exposes deliberate choices made repeatedly by individuals and organizations over time. Yet memory remains fragile. Denial, distortion, and minimization persist. As the last survivors pass away, the risk grows that history will be abstracted, sanitized, or weaponized for political ends. Sachsenhausen's legacy depends not on stone monuments alone, but on education that explains systems, not just outcomes. Without understanding how terror was organized, remembrance becomes ritual without warning. The camp's history also raises an unsettling question. What would justice look like? Even now, no verdict can restore the dead. No sentence can erase suffering. Justice, in this context, is not closure, it is responsibility carried forward. It is vigilance against the reappearance of the same patterns under different names. Sachsenhausen teaches that evil does not always announce itself with chaos. It can arrive quietly, wearing uniforms, issuing forms, and following procedures. It can be taught, practiced, and improved. That is its most enduring danger and its most urgent lesson. As we approach the final segment of this documentary, the story turns from history to obligation. Sachsenhausen is not only something to remember, it is something to recognize. Its systems did not vanish with the Reich. They wait dormant wherever authority is divorced from humanity and obedience is prized above conscience. Chapter 10, Segment 3. The Final Warning. How Sachsenhausen Still Speaks to the Present. Sachsenhausen did not end when the last SS guards fled or when the gates were opened by advancing armies. In many ways, that moment marked the beginning of its most important role, not as a functioning camp, but as a mirror held up to the modern world. What Sachsenhausen reveals is not only what the Nazis did, but how they learned to do it, refined it, and normalized it until terror felt administrative, routine, and justified. That lesson did not expire in 1945. The camp's true legacy lies in its structure. Sachsenhausen was built deliberately, methodically, with an emphasis on visibility, control, and efficiency. Every pathway, every barracks placement, every punishment method served a psychological purpose. Prisoners were meant to understand, at all times, that power was absolute and resistance futile. This was not cruelty born of chaos, it was cruelty engineered for predictability. That distinction matters because predictability is what makes systems repeatable. What makes Sachsenhausen especially dangerous as a historical precedent is that it did not rely on constant mass killing to function. Much of its power came from anticipation, the knowledge that punishment could arrive at any moment, for any reason, through mechanisms already perfected. Terror was embedded into daily routine. Over time, violence no longer needed to be spectacular to be effective, it only needed to be possible. This is how control becomes self-sustaining. Equally important is who made Sachsenhausen work. It was not only sadists or ideological fanatics. It was clerks who filed reports, engineers who optimized layouts, doctors who recorded data, and officers who trained recruits. Many believed they were doing their jobs well. Others convinced themselves they were powerless to stop what they did not initiate. The camp thrived on this fragmentation of responsibility, where no single person felt fully accountable for the outcome. This diffusion of guilt is one of Sachsenhausen's most unsettling lessons. When wrongdoing is divided into small tasks, it becomes easier to perform without moral reckoning. The camp teaches us that systems of harm do not require universal hatred, they require participation without reflection. They require obedience framed as professionalism and silence framed as neutrality. After the war, this realization slowly reshaped how genocide was understood. The Holocaust was no longer explained solely as an eruption of irrational hatred, but as the outcome of rational planning applied to inhuman goals. Sachsenhausen became evidence that modernity itself, its bureaucracies, technologies, and hierarchies, could be turned into tools of annihilation if stripped of ethical limits. This is why remembrance alone is not enough. Memorials can preserve facts, but they cannot prevent repetition unless those facts are understood as processes, not just events. Sachsenhausen warns against the temptation to believe that it could never happen again, simply because circumstances have changed. The mechanisms remain disturbingly familiar: dehumanization, classification, exclusion, normalization, escalation. The camp also challenges comforting narratives about resistance. While acts of defiance existed, they were constrained by a system designed to isolate, starve, and exhaust. Sachsenhausen shows that expecting heroism under total domination is unrealistic and unfair. The responsibility for preventing atrocity does not rest on victims resisting. It rests on societies refusing to build the machinery in the first place. In the present, echoes of Sachsenhausen appear whenever institutions prioritize efficiency over dignity, security over humanity, or obedience over conscience. They appear when people are reduced to categories, when suffering is reframed as necessary, and when responsibility is deflected upward or downward instead of owned. These echoes do not announce themselves with uniforms or slogans. They arrive quietly, wrapped in policy language and procedural necessity. The final warning of Sachsenhausen is not apocalyptic. It is practical. It tells us that terror does not require monsters. It requires systems that reward compliance, punish dissent, and distance individuals from consequences. It reminds us that laws can be unjust, orders can be immoral, and routines can be lethal. As survivors fade from living memory, the obligation shifts to institutions, educators, and individuals to preserve not only what happened, but how it happened. Forgetting the mechanisms is more dangerous than forgetting the numbers. Numbers shock, mechanisms instruct. Sachsenhausen stands today not as a relic of a vanished evil, but as proof that evil can be taught, standardized, and exported. It was the classroom where Nazi terror learned its craft. Understanding that fact transforms the camp from a historical site into a warning system. The story of Sachsenhausen does not end with liberation or memorialization. It ends and begins again. Each time a society chooses whether efficiency matters more than ethics, whether obedience outweighs responsibility, and whether silence feels safer than resistance. The camp's final lesson is clear. The line between civilization and atrocity is thinner than we want to believe, and it is drawn not by ideology alone, but by everyday choices. To remember Sachsenhausen is not simply to honor the dead. It is to accept a burden, the burden of recognizing early signs, questioning authority, and refusing to participate in systems that make cruelty ordinary. History does not repeat itself automatically. It repeats when people allow it to, and that is why Sachsenhausen still matters. The weight of REMEMBRANC Sachsenhausen was not built to be remembered. It was built to function, efficiently, quietly, and without question. And yet it endures, not because its walls still stand, or because its name appears in history books, but because the system it perfected did not require hatred alone to survive. It required order, obedience, silence, the willingness to follow rules without asking where they lead. The men, women, and children who passed through Sachsenhausen were not destroyed by chaos. They were destroyed by structure, by schedules, files, routines, and rules that stripped humanity away one decision at a time. That is what makes this camp more than a place of suffering. It makes it a warning that genocide does not begin with violence. It begins with classification, with obedience, with the slow acceptance of injustice as normal. Remembering Sachsenhausen is not about looking backward in horror, it is about looking forward with responsibility. About recognizing how easily systems can be twisted, how quickly morality can be replaced by procedure, and how dangerous it becomes when no one feels accountable. The victims of Sachsenhausen were silenced by design. Our duty is to make sure that silence never returns. Because the moment we stop asking questions, the moment we stop remembering how terror was engineered, is the moment history becomes vulnerable to repetition. This is why we remember. This is why we document. This is why we speak. Not to dwell in darkness, but to ensure it never becomes ordinary again. May their memory endure, and may the lessons of Sachsenhausen never be ignored.